Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hello, my dear friends. Have you ever thought about the diseases that quietly change the world? Not the ones that caused dramatic plagues overnight, but the ones that slipped in slowly, hiding beneath the surface of history, altering the fates of kings and common people alike. Today we are diving into one of those stories. It's a tale that begins with something small, a tiny sore, and spirals out into something massive, reshaping medicine, toppling reputations, and even influencing the course of empires. So settle in. This is the story of a disease that for centuries was whispered about, feared, and misunderstood. And by the time we're done, you'll see it's about so much more than just an illness. Let's start with something a bit more unsettling than a simple bedtime story. This is the story of syphilis, a disease that moved beneath silk robes and royal crowns, quietly reshaping lives and even the fate of thrones. Forget the polished portraits and heroic tales you might have heard. Behind all those grand banquets and waving banners, there was a hidden world of secrets and silent fear, a fear strong enough to destroy reputations, just as easily as armies knock down city walls. The honest truth is, if you found yourself in a 16th century royal court or a busy port town, your chances of staying healthy and unmarked were pretty slim. Back then, disease, ignorance, and scandal were everyday threats that could wreck a person's body and reputation before they even knew what hit them. Before we get too far into this, if you're enjoying what you're hearing, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I'd also love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing to see people from all over the world joining in on these journeys. Now, let's dim the lights and step into tonight's darker path together. Bones hold secrets. They carry the slow, patient testimony of centuries within the fragile white of a skull, the healed bumps along a shin bone, or the worn-away surface of a nasal bone that once held cartilage and breath. For historians and the paleopathologists who dig through old cemeteries and monastery grounds, these marks are both clues and puzzles, silent proof of a disease that changed the way we think about medicine, warfare, and even shame. The debate over where syphilis started is really a debate about those bones and about the voyages that connected the world into one giant network of people, goods, and tiny, unseen microbes. It's a discussion that stretches from Columbus's ships crossing the Atlantic all the way to the dark, dusty burial grounds of medieval Europe. And at its heart, it asks a big question. How do we decide if a disease is truly new or just newly noticed? One story, known as the Columbian hypothesis, is the simplest and most dramatic to tell. It suggests that a pathogen from the Americas made its way to Europe after the first contacts in 1492. It traveled in the bellies of ships and inside the bodies of sailors, and once it arrived in Europe, it found the perfect conditions to turn from a local infection into a fast-spreading venereal epidemic. This idea fits nicely into a bigger story that modern historians have been telling for a while, the story of the Columbian Exchange. That was the massive swapping of plants, animals, and diseases that sent corn, smallpox, and tomatoes across oceans, completely changing diets and death rates around the world. Alfred W. Crosby, a historian, made this idea famous in the 20th century, talking about how this exchange of unintended cargo had global consequences. For those who believe this theory, the bones found in the Caribbean, Mexico, and the Andes are the key evidence. They've found signs of treponemal infections, the family of bacteria that includes syphilis, dating back to before Columbus arrived. This suggests that different forms of these microbes were common among indigenous people for centuries. There was a whole variety of these germs, and from them, a new venereal form may have emerged. When scientists look at ancient American skeletons and see certain bone reactions and skull lesions, and see that treponemal disease was present in both pre- and post-contact populations, it seems like a pretty clear sign of where it all began. But then there's the other theory, the one that says the disease was already in Europe. This idea is quieter, scrappier, and harder to shake. It points to European graves from before 1492 that show some of the same kinds of bone damage. Things like pitting on the skull, known as kerysicca, known as Sika,
or the bowed shin bone, called saber shin, and the destruction of facial bones.
People who support this view remind us that treponema bacteria are complex, and how they show up in bones depends on a lot of things like age, nutrition, climate, and social habits. In warm, humid parts of Africa or the Americas, non-venereal forms of treponema disease, like yaws and Biegel, are common and leave bone marks that look very similar to venereal syphilis. In the crowded and cold parts of medieval Europe, a treponemal germ could have simply acted differently, or it might have gone unnoticed by doctors, until it became more obvious in the late 15th century. A single medieval friary, a rural cemetery here or there, a few odd-looking bones. These are enough to whisper the idea that the disease had been quietly waiting in Europe for centuries. This debate isn't just about old history. It's about scale and meaning. If syphilis really came from the New World, then it's a powerful symbol of the biological consequences of empire and unseen cost that Europeans both brought with them and brought back. If it was already old in Europe, then the story shifts. It becomes about how we interpret things, about how medical observation changes over time, about how city life can turn a familiar bug into a social disaster, and about how chroniclers can turn something that was once ignored into a new kind of horror. This is why paleopathology matters, and also why it can sometimes lead us astray. Bones can show signs of treponemal infection with a lot of detail, but they can't always tell us exactly which subspecies of the bacterium made those marks. The bacterium that causes venereal syphilis, Treponema pallidum subs. P. pallidum is a close cousin to the bugs that cause yaws and Biegel. On a skeleton, these cousins look like siblings. The kinds of bone changes, new bone growth, destructive lesions around the nose, scars on the skull, are all shared. Paleopathologists have come up with careful ways to weigh the evidence, looking at patterns, the age of the person when they died, and what makes sense geographically. They use the context of the burial, the person's diet, and historical texts to piece things together. But bones don't give up their DNA easily. The thin strands of treponemal DNA that might still be in an old jawbone are fragile. They break down in the soil and can easily be contaminated by modern stuff. That's where molecular science has tried to step in to do what bones alone can: question the pathogen itself. In the 21st century, labs started using ancient DNA methods to pull fragments of treponemal genomes from old remains. When they succeeded, it was a big deal. When researchers could place these ancient treponemal sequences in a family tree alongside modern strains, they could start to figure out where the lineages split and which forms came first. Early results seemed to lean toward a New World origin for venereal syphilis. They found sequences that matched the treponemal diversity in the Americas, and family trees suggested that the venereal strains might have grown out of New World forms. But this molecular story isn't neat and tidy. Treponemes swap genetic material more than you'd expect, and the molecular clocks we use to date ancestors are pretty delicate. Different models give different dates. Some analyses put the common ancestor of modern venereal syphilis centuries, even millennia, before Columbus. Others place the split right around the time of early modern travel. So, the scholarly work had to get creative. Archaeologists dug up graves and measured lesions. Geneticists coaxed DNA out of old teeth. Historians combed through court records, ship logs, and old medical books. Each field brought its own strengths and its own blind spots. The historian looks at stories, dates, and motives, like the Italian wars, the movement of armies, the spread of rumors. The paleopathologist looks at patterns of bone changes across different places. The molecular biologist looks at base pairs that suggest family ties, but can't always pin those ties to one specific time and place. Slowly, the debate has moved away from triumphant certainty and toward a messy, cross-disciplinary understanding. What we can say with confidence is that treponemal disease was widespread in the Americas before Columbus. We can say that a sudden, severe pox was first written about in European records in 1494 to 95, and we can say that the genetic evidence hasn't yet given us a final, unarguable answer. That uncertainty itself is telling. It shows us how the history of disease lives in the space where bodies, texts, ships, and bones all overlap. The European outbreak that really makes this story feel real began in the cold, hard logic of war. In the autumn of 1494, Charles VIII of France led his army across the Alps and into the patchwork of Italian states, heading for the Kingdom of Naples. He moved with the planning of a king and the speed of a man who believed he could win his throne with force and speed. His army was a mix of everything: French knights on their heavy horses, Swiss and German mercenaries, camp followers, settlers, and the usual crowd of women and traders who always gathered around military camps back then. Armies back then carried more than just banners and cannons. They carried food, letters, money, and germs. They brought their habits and their taste for simple pleasures. Where soldiers marched, sex workers followed. A new pox appeared in the winter of 1494-95, like a shadow that grew faster than the light. The writers of the time, both Italian and French, wrote with a mix of awe and panic. They called it a new malady because it looked new to the people who mattered. The educated city doctors and officials who kept the records. It caused skin rashes, painful ulcers, swollen glands, and in the stories that would be told for decades, it was known for attacking the body in the places where lovers had touched. These are the traits that made it a scandal. They are also the traits that let it spread fast among the people most likely to pass it on. The speed of its spread had real military consequences. Siege warfare, a big part of Italian fighting, depended on having enough soldiers and keeping up their spirits. A smaller, sicker army meant fewer men to hold wars, worse discipline, and more looting when pay and food ran out. And as the sick were pushed aside, ships suffered too. Ports, where sailors came ashore, Genoa, Naples, Barcelona, and later the big Atlantic ports of Seville and Lisbon, became major hubs for the disease. Once the pox took hold, city records show more sick soldiers, more people admitted to hospitals, and in some cities, a new focus on regulating the sex trade. It's worth noting that this first big outbreak happened right in the middle of the political drama on the Italian peninsula. The League of Venice, a group formed in 1495 to push back the French, brought together the Holy Roman Empire, Milan, Venice, and Spain. Soldiers moved, states maneuvered, and the disease moved right along with them. Doctors back then were baffled, but creative. Their world wasn't sterile. It was built on humoral theory, the idea that health came from balancing the body's fluids. But this new pox didn't fit easily into those old ideas. Treatments fell into two main categories: purging the body and treating the visi. Blaze sores. Mercury became the main weapon, even though it was brutal. Used as an ointment, a pill, or inhaled as a vapor, mercury made patients salivate heavily, which doctors thought meant it was working, but its effects were toxic and damaging. On the other hand, remedies from the New World also appeared. Guaiacán, a wood brought back by Spanish sailors, was promoted as a sweat-inducing cure that would pull the sickness out. It was sold with promises of miracles, and for a hefty price. Medical arguments filled pamphlets, echoed in royal courts, and slowly spread from surgeons to barbers to pharmacists. A few names stand out: Girolamo Fracastoro, an Italian doctor and poet born in 1478, gave the disease its name in a 1530 Latin poem, Syphilis sive morbus Gallicus, where he created a mythical figure, Syphilis, to explain the disease's origin. The poem was more than just poetry. It shaped medical language. Later, in 1546, Fracastoro wrote De Contagione, a text that looked beyond humors and toward the idea of contagion through tiny particles, seeds of disease passed by touch, clothing, and air. He didn't invent the idea of contagion, but he pushed doctors to think about it in a more systematic way. Ambroise Paré, a French surgeon, who lived from 1510 to 1590 and served kings on battlefields, wrote practically about wounds and the pox, looking for better surgical methods while sometimes cautiously using mercury. Paracelsus, the provocative Swiss medical reformer, criticized traditional medicine and pushed for chemical treatments. He too left his mark on the era's medical debates. This epidemic changed more than just medical practice. Cities had to adapt. Governments tried to regulate the places where the disease spread most easily. The docks where sailors looked for company. The brothels where infection could pass between people. The garrisons where soldiers shared tight spar. Says some cities licensed and monitored sex work because officials thought a regulated trade could be cleaner than one that hid in the shadows. Others shut down brothels, kicked out foreign sex workers, or demanded medical checks. The logic wasn't really about being kind. It was practical. Sick troops couldn't be trusted in battle. City funds bled out on caring for the sick, and social order cracked when disease mixed with questions of honor and marriage. So, this venereal pox became a matter of statecraft, and because it was venereal, it was quickly tied to morality. Preachers and pamphleteers used it as proof of sign. The armies of Charles VIII, already guilty of plundering in Italy, made an easy scapegoat. The pox wasn't just a medical emergency, it was a moral warning that clergy could use to preach about temperance and the dangers of careless soldiers. The dark humor of the courts, blaming one nation against another, showed up in the names people gave the disease. Naming things was a small ritual that hid a big aggression. When Italians called it the French pox and the French called it the Neapolitan disease, they weren't making a clinical observation. They were pointing fingers across the diplomatic table. The Latin modus gallicus, or French disease, became the standard term in medical texts across Europe. But the disease got all sorts of names that fit the politics of the moment. The English preferred the French label. The Italians shot back with malfrances. The Spanish, with wounded pride, sometimes called it morbo napolitano in the Ottoman Balkans and in Persian lands. It became Fangio Farangi, a name derived from franc, a common term for Western Europeans. In South Asia, thanks to Portuguese contact, it was called Farangi Roga, the foreign disease, a label that stuck for centuries in some languages. Language itself was a kind of smear test. Calling the disease after your enemy let you clear your own people of blame and gave you a neat, if dishonest, moral story. These names had real consequences. They shaped stigma and laws. Calling an illness foreign meant you could identify its supposed cause and imagine the solution as keeping outsiders out. Cities drew borders, sometimes as actual barriers, sometimes as paperwork, that kept certain sailors from coming ashore without a clean bill of health. Diplomatic relations cooled when an outbreak seemed to come from a neighbor. Accusations and denials showed up in official letters and in the biting satirical letters and in the biting satirical prints that circulated in later centuries. It's one of the oldest tricks in international politics. If you can't win the moral argument, name your enemy as the source of the disease. This naming also led to scapegoating closer to home. Sex workers faced the double burden of poverty and assumed guilt. In some cities, they were rounded up for checks. In others, they were pushed underground, losing what little safety regulation might have offered. Soldiers with the pox were labeled immoral and weak. In some places, they were punished or kicked out. Jews and other marginalized groups were sometimes accused in the lazy spread of rumors of poisoning wells or selling disease as a secret. The language of sin and the language of cleanliness mixed dangerously, and the pox became a tool for moral control as much as a medical one. For the elites, the doctors, the officials, the disease needed to be managed. That meant new kinds of record-keeping, registers of hospital admissions, reports from court doctors to kings, and rules controlling movement and behavior. For regular people, the experience was different and quieter. There was shame, hiding symptoms, and the slow loss of the chance to have children, as congenital syphilis left a terrible mark on families. Whole households, would be affected by laws that limited who could marry or inherit if a history of infection could be brought up. Treatment was expensive and often as dangerous as the disease itself. Mercury might make patients drool and leave them weak in other ways. The so-called cures, like a bark from the New World, a sweat treatment, or a poultice, were sold in the everyday market of hope. were sold in the everyday market of hope. Peddlers made fortunes, and so did charlatans. Historians who study the pox aren't just interested in the disease itself. They look at logistics, how armies moved and what their camp hygiene was like. The patterns of sailors on leave in ports like Genoa or Naples. How merchants traveled between ports and markets. How the timing of harvests and fairs brought crowds together in ways that let disease spread. They read the disease into economic records. The loss of workers like artisans and sailors. The taxes imposed to care for the sick. The disruption of marriage markets, when blame was easy to find and hard to prove. They see the pox as something that made existing social anxieties worse, about migration, about crowded cities, about the bodies of the poor. This is why the debate over where the pox came from never stayed just an academic argument. To say it came from the Americas was to say something about empire, about guilt, about responsibility. To insist it was already in Europe was to shift the blame and to tell a story about internal decline rather than outside contamination. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, nationalist feelings sometimes made these debates into something like cultural shrapnel. Doctors in Paris, Vienna, and London wrote passionately, with national pride coloring their words. In the late 20th century, with new molecular methods and a renewed interest in global history, scholars went back to the bones and the archives, trying to make the evidence do heavier work. Today, the sex. Tory is more cautious and open to different views. We accept that treponema disease was common in the New World before Columbus, and that the European epidemic in the 15th century was a turning point in how we saw a venereal form of the disease. We also accept that bones can be misleading, that the signs in the skeleton are often unclear, and that genetic reconstructions are always provisional. The most interesting conclusion, maybe, is more about society than about the microbe. When a new stigmatizing disease appears in public, the names people give it, the scapegoats they pick, and the cures they reach for tell us just as much about their politics and fears as they do about the germ itself. So, the pox drove kings mad, not in a literal sense always, but by messing up the careful calculations of power. Courts had to pay for care. Armies lost men to a slow decline that hurt their campaigns. Cities had to deal with the markets of sex and health and found themselves policing private lives in ways that would echo through the development of modern government. What was once a private misfortune became a public issue, and that public issue, in the language of the time, took the form of blame. The French did it, the Neapolitans did it, the Spanish did it, the Franks did it. Somewhere in all those layered accusations, the real truth stayed quieter, hidden in bed sheets and deep in bones, waiting for a later age of microscopes and DNA to make its claims. The pox, for all its noisy history, eventually settled into a new human geography. It became one of the diseases that shaped how modern medicine names, diagnoses, and treats. It pushed early modern doctors to think about contagion in ways that slowly and unevenly fed into later germ theory. It forced states to try to manage bodies for the sake of labor, order, and diplomacy. And it left its mark on language across continent. Spharangi, the French pox. Words that still survive in dictionaries and in the odd tell-in phrases of law and everyday speech. Bones hold their breath. Ships kept coming. Courts kept sending men to war. And that tiny, corkscrew-shaped bacterium found new ways to move through an increasingly connected world. The scholars who sift through this history do it partly because it's a story of movement, and partly because it's about how human communities react to the sudden, embarrassing presence of a disease that threatens both body and reputation. It's a tale of adaptation, of wrongly assigned blame, of medical improvisation, and of political shortcuts, of a continent-wide shrug that said, in so many languages, "Not my fault." To listen to these centuries is to learn how fragile the lines are between foreign and native, between disease and sin, between cure and cruelty. It's to see that the arrival of the pox in Europe in the 1490s was a turning point. It pushed forward conversations about contagion. It forced experiments in public health management and it changed the social world of intimacy. The debate about where it came from will probably never be fully settled because the data, the bones, the DNA, the patchy archives doesn't give us one clear answer. But the bigger lesson is how this pathogen changed human thinking. Armies changed how they supplied their men. Port cities rethought how they managed sailors. Doctors suggested new models of disease. Theologians grabbed the chance to preach restraint. And in the slow, often darkly funny process of naming things, Europe learned to blame. It found a useful habit. Nations are good at naming what they fear in another language. The French were the first to be blamed by others. Then the French blamed someone else. The disease got a geography of blame, as neat and dishonest as any border map. That geography taught a lesson about the limits of togetherness and about how fast private matters become public policy when public order is at risk. If you listen closely to the archivists and to the bones, you'll hear under all the names and medical jargon a quieter, more human lament about families, about babies born sick, about the frightened hand of a woman who went to a city hospital hoping for a cure and instead found a bed and a line in a ledger. The big events, Charles VIII's March, the crossing of the Atlantic, the debates in fancy salons, are like stage directions. The real story is also found at home. The ways hospitals learned to record a disease, the way a court doctor advised a king, the bargain a merchant made with a surgeon for a remedy, the bargain a merchant made with a surgeon for a remedy, the way a city clerk counted the days a soldier was unfit for duty. Those small administrative acts became the foundation of a new kind of public health, and they shaped lives in ways too quiet for the grand chronicles, but no less important. The pox lived in the details of policy, just as much as in the drama of an epidemic, and that's why historians, doctors, and the sleepless people who go to bed thinking about bones and ships will never stop turning this story over. Because each new dig, each new bit of DNA, pulled from an old skeleton, each newly digitalized old ledger, gives us another small piece of light on a disease that was, for a time, the shape of a continent's anxiety. It taught Europe how fast a private wound could become a public problem, how easily blame becomes a weapon, and how, in both small medicine and big politics, the same human urge to point outward is often worse than any germ it tries to blame. The first sign of syphilis showed up with a kind of insulting modesty, a small, firm sore, often painless, an ulcer that had the terrible grace to look like nothing much at all. Men and women, soldiers and servants, nobles and sex workers, wherever the pox found a home, they'd notice this sore and think it was just a bug bite, a nick from shaving, the result of a careless night. It sat like a punctuation mark at the spot where infection entered, the genitals, the lips, the fingers of a midwife, the mouth of a nursing baby. The sore was clever. It didn't demand attention and didn't cause pain. A patient might be reassured by how quiet it was. Doctors, often clueless and hopeful, were easily fooled. Only later would the body speak the name in a harsher voice. Weeks after that first sore came the second stage, and then the disease showed off its dramatic side. It loved to surprise. A rash would spread across the body, showing up on the palms and soles where other illnesses rarely go. And for that reason, many doctors learned to pay attention. It could be a red, bumpy rash, sometimes with pustules, sometimes so faint you'd miss it if you weren't looking. Sometimes it was so full of germs and so contagious that bed sheets, clothes, and lovers' mouths could spread the story. Mucus patches would form on the tongue and inside the mouth, shiny, highly infectious, shedding the germ into kisses and onto doctors' gloves alike. Condylomata lata, wet and broad plaques in the groin or around the anus, showed up with a kind of grotesque intimacy. Patients were amazed at the variety of marks on their skin, on their mucous membranes, in their eyes, and so were the doctors, who started using the disease's theatrical nature as a way to diagnose it. The irony was that the most obvious signs were often the least painful. Syphilis favored secrecy and spectacle, pain and show, in uneven amounts. Between these two visible stages, And after them, the disease pulled back into a kind of deception that has haunted doctors for centuries. Latency. For months, even years, a person could look healthy. They might have a healed sore, a fading rash, and go on with life. Have a child, get a new title, sign a peace treaty. The body's temporary peace wasn't a cure. It was hiding. Doctors in the early modern period, raised on humoral theory and dramatic ideas about illness, found latency frustrating. How could you fight a disease that disappeared from the skin's surface, only to pop up later in the heart, the brain, the bones? They couldn't. Silence had become the disease's best partner. When syphilis returned in its third stage, the body's organs paid the price. Soft, gummy tumors of flesh would appear in the skin, liver, bones. They could hollow out the nasal passages and collapse the bridge of the nose into what we now call a saddle nose. In the bones, chronic inflammation could thicken the shins until they bowed out, the so-called saber shin of congenital cases, a bowed leg that children would carry like a painful badge. In the heart and the aorta, the disease could cause swelling and bulging and an aneurysm. A man might go from being strong to suddenly hollow-chested, the main artery giving way with a quiet, internal betrayal. Surgeons of the 18th and 19th centuries, called to cut into these aneurysms, learned the limits of what a blade and stitches could do. The disease was relentless and patient. And the brain. The brain was syphilis' favorite stage. Neurosyphilis, as doctors learned to call it, comes in many disguises. Tabes dorsalis creeps in slowly, a wearing away of the nerves in the spinal cord. It steals your sense of where your body is, leaving a person with a wide stomping walk, feet slapping the ground like they're on a swaying ship. Lightning-like pains stir. Ike without warning. Reflexes vanish. The knee-jerk reactions we take for granted disappear. Then there's general paresis, an old name that captures a grim progression. Personality thins out. Judgment dissolves. Speech becomes hesitant, then slurred. The person might become grandiose and bizarre, then mute and helpless. The face may tighten and shrink. The mind, once a map of well-traveled roads, crumbles into dust. Ophthalmic syphilis can steal sight. Meningovascular syphilis cuts off small blood vessels, causing strokes in people not yet old enough to expect them. The person with neurosyphilis often confused 19th century asylum doctors because the cause was hidden, invisible under the microscopes of the day, until the early 20th century. The tragedy of congenital syphilis is a chapter written across generations. When a pregnant woman had the infection, the baby bore the damage in the womb. Babies might be stillborn or die within days. Those who survived carried the marks of syphilis in their bodies. They filled children's wards and parish records with names and dates, with stories of teeth and bones. Newborns snuffled, their nasal discharge so heavy that doctors called it snuffles. Their faces already hinted at future deformity, the bridge of the nose collapsing, the teeth notched and small, the ears failing to hear. In the Victorian age, a doctor named Hutchinson catalogued a triad of symptoms: interstitial keratitis, notched teeth, and nerve deafness. That became a way for generations of doctors to name the disease. And with it, the cruelty that a child could be given this disease without having sinned. Bone inflammation in children was different from the adult sabershins. Their bones thickened, bowed, the rhythm of growth was thrown off. A whole future bent under the weight of an infection passed across love, or neglect, or the casual ignorance of an uncaring woe. Railed. Sometimes the historical record gives us portraits, so sharp they chill. In the late 16th century, doctors kept notes describing court patients whose bodies slowly, inexplicably revealed what had been whispered at the palace gate. Ambroise Paré, the French royal surgeon, wrote of sores that would vanish, and men who would return months later with swollen limbs or madness that no prayer could fix. Physicians at the Spanish court recorded infants dying within days and older children walking with bowed legs. By the 19th century, hospitals and asylums were full of what old doctors called the paralytics, men once eloquent and productive who lost their speech, who became like children, helpless. The files, often clinical and dry, sometimes have a single line that says more than any sermon: Patient exhibited paranoia and aphasia after years of intermittent lesions. Previously employed as magistrate. Mental faculties declined over 5 years. The indignity is in the plainness. For generations, doctors were often the last to be believed. The outside signs, a pale rash, odd plaques, the lack of pain, made the disease easy to mistake for anything else. A sore, a cold sore, a bad boil. The list of possible mistakes is long, and the correct diagnosis often came too late. That delay was the disease's cunning. You could be a king, and the pox could be your secret. You could be a queen without a child, and your womb could be the public's tool for rumor. In the quiet hallways of palaces, the pox became a political tool because it took time, and time makes kings and reputations brittle. Courts, just like doctors, learned the language of the pox. The very names people gave the disease were insults thrown across borders. The French disease in Italy, the Italian disease in France, the Spanish disease elsewhere. The labels were less about where it came from than about accusation. To call a sickness by a foreign name was to point a finger. When the disease arrived in large numbers among French soldiers coming back from Naples in 1495, writers of the time wrote with a mix of moral fury and clinical wonder. Charles VIII's Italian campaign has been seen by some historians as a key vector. Soldiers' bodies crowded into ports and taverns. Soldiers make careless partners in careless courts. The rumor mill started spinning. At court, rumor had teeth. An accusation that a noble had the pox could be a political dagger. It could make heirs look illegitimate. It could break marriage plans. The medical record was often private and guarded, but the gossip of servants and the chatter of bitter courtiers spread faster than any doctor could travel. A prince known to have sores might be pushed aside as unfit for a dynastic marriage. On the other hand, an arrival might be smeared with allegations in a pamphlet or whispered about in the chancellery. The politics of contagion also had practical dimensions. A king unable to function because of neurosyphilis couldn't negotiate treaties or lead armies. He needed a regent. Power would shift. Alliances would be redrawn based on a doctor's uncertain schedule. Clear, documented cases of kings and nobles who definitely had syphilis are pretty rare in early modern records, because the disease was private and rumors made certainty hard. Still, certain royal courts leave clearer traces. The English royal physician's notes from the 17th century, for example, record treatments given to courtiers for pox-like symptoms. In France, the royal apothecary's inventories show stocks of mercury and guaya, come for use at the palace. Ambroise Paré treated nobles wounded in campaigns and also tended to venereal complaints among the soldiers camped near the court. Physicians' ledgers bear columns of names, remedies given, fees taken, are as political as any treaty because they show how illness and privilege mixed and where secrecy and influence paid off. Sometimes the crown itself stumbled visibly. A king who grew paranoid, who spoke in riddles, who refused advice. These weren't just medical reports, they were political facts. Vacancy and capacity had strategic consequences. Regencies, councils, factions, foreign interventions. The incapacity of a ruler for health reasons was a logistical crisis. Courts are machines built on the idea that someone keeps the throttle steady. A ruler made useless by neurosyphilis left a vacuum that courtiers and foreign powers rushed to fill. The very rumor of disease could be an excuse for a coup, an annulment, or a change in succession. Worse, it could bring out a rival brand of medical charlatan, eager to perform a miracle cure in front of the king's courtiers and pocket the favor that followed. Accusations could be used in more personal ways, too, to slander a fiancé or break a marriage treaty. A noblewoman accused of bringing syphilis into a household could be cast as immoral and unfit to inherit property. Man accused of the pox was seen as morally suspect and politically dangerous. In a world where law, family line, and legitimacy were all held together by custom and blood, disease could be used as evidence. It was a kind of inconvenient handwriting. If a child was born deformed, or if an heir died young, questions were asked. Was the wife sick? The husband? The lover? Public health, such as it was, never stayed separate from private malice. Yet historians have to be careful about naming names. Rumor is a noisy thing. It loves to exaggerate. Many claims of royal syphilis, when looked at closely, turn out to be more guesswork than fact. For example, the scandalous letters and the juicy rumors about the Borgia family have been read for centuries as proof of venereal disease. But the actual records are tangled up with political attacks and later moralizing histories that turn rumors into supposed facts. Where the record is clearer, like in the inventories of apothecaries or in physicians' notes, you can see the clear presence of treatments, mercury ointments, fumigations, blistering agents. These lists show how much of a court's resources went into a disease that the princes preferred to keep invisible. The treatments prescribed for this illness, in their harsh earnestness, deserve a history almost as long as the disease itself. Medicine responded the way people do, under pressure when the cause is hidden and the outcome is terrible, by doing something. If a cure couldn't be guaranteed, at least they could try, and the attempts were often as vicious as the illness. Mercury was the mainstay, the silver hammer of a world that believed in fighting poison with poison. Applied on the skin as an ointment, rubbed into the groin or chest until the skin blistered. Given by mouth as blue pills, calomel, mercurous chloride. Burned into vapor in cramped rooms where the patient breathed in the metal until their breath tasted like copper. Mercury promised a way out. It had a kind of logic. Metal for metal. A strong purge for a disease that caused lesions. Mercury made patients salivate, which doctors saw as the body trying to get rid of the poison. If the mouth flooded and the gums bled, the treatment was considered to be working. The symptom was, back then, the proof. The results were often worse. Mercury poisoning caused stupor, shaking, too much saliva, and loose teeth. Teeth loosened and fell out. The kidneys suffered, and many patients died, not from the pox, but from the cure. Yet the sight of drool and bleeding gums reassured both doctor and patient. It was a visible sign that something serious and costly was being done. The New World offered its own supposed cure. Guaiacum wood from the West Indies was praised in the 16th century as a cure that, if brewed and drunk or used in heated baths to make you sweat, would draw the disease out. Europeans, newly connected to a hemisphere full of new plants and powders, imported guaiacum eagerly. The treatment fit with humoral logic. It made you sweat, which was supposed to purge the bad humors, and then the humors would be balanced. A royal doctor might order a long guaiacum treatment. The patient, locked in a steamy room, wrapped in blankets, made to sweat until their skin shone, and their body felt weak. It was expensive and theatrical. True cures were rare, but the cost created a new social meaning. To undergo the guaiacum cure showed you were worth saving. The poor, whose bodies showed the disease in full, could rarely afford such elaborate therapies. In that way, treatment became a social signal as much as a medical act. Other remedies, some from folk practice, some from serious medical theory, poured into European pharmacies. For a while, the faith in sweating and purging was joined by a belief in venom and counter-venom, blistering agents, mustard plasters, and cautery. Doctors used laxatives. They bled patients. They applied suction cups. They did what they could within the world they understood. Paracelsus, in the early 16th century, was one of those who proposed chemical remedies, mercury in specific forms and doses, rather than just humoral purging, and his followers saw chemical therapy as a path forward. Yet dosage was still a blunt tool. In trying to make the body resistant to infection, doctors sometimes rubbed on mercury until the skin wore away, an assault that matched the disease's own destructiveness. Charlatans also made a killing. The spectacle of sickness invites theater. Traveling vendors, some honest and some not, promised miracle cures. One-night cures were advertised in markets and on flyers. They'd make a patient sweat in a tent, rub them with a secret balm, apply an ointment that smelled of sulfur and copper, and charge an outrageous fee. Public spectacle fueled stigma. If the cure failed, the patient was shamed twice, first by the disease, then by their public failure. If it seemed to work, often temporarily, given the disease's habit of hiding, The healer gained fame and more clients. The desperation of the sick created a market for dubious medicine and dramatic, often cruel, therapies. Mercury and guaiacum shared an effect beyond the physical. They became cultural markers. To be treated with mercury was to be marked as morally suspect in the public mind. A drooling patient walking the streets of Madrid or Naples might not look different from someone with another illness, but the knowledge that mercury had been used told onlookers a story. This person had sinned, and the metal was both punishment and treatment. The image of the pox patient, smeared with ointment sweating under a canopy, showed up in sermons and plays. The disease was tied to shame, and the treatments, meant to save, became a form of public penance. Clinical despair found other, later remedies. In the 19th century, medical science started to reorganize around observation and experiment. Surgeons and physicians like John Hunter in Britain and Philippe Ricord in France argued, with varying degrees of cruelty and curiosity, about the nature of venereal disease. Hunter's self-experimentation, a famous and morally troubling episode, led him to believe that gonorrhea and syphilis were the same disease after he injected himself with material from a patient's urethral discharge and got a complex infection. His ideas carried weight in British medicine for decades. Ricord, working later in the century, separated the two diseases clinically and argued strongly that gonorrhea and syphilis were different, refining how doctors understood primary and secondary sores. These doctors were working in a time with no effective antibiotic, and their staging of the disease helped guide when to use mercury and how to understand relapses. The spectacle of treatment could itself become a political tool. At court, being the patient of the king's physician mattered. Keep a royal doctor happy, and you might get a favorable opinion in a fight over succession. The physician's notes and receipts could be used as legal evidence. Was a ruler fit for the throne? If a doctor said the king was insane or unfit because of a chronic disease, those words could be the start of a regency. Physicians were, in that way, keepers of power. Their pens could be as decisive as any sword. But their reports could also be bought, hidden, or forged. The clinical and the political overlapped, and the pox, silent, patient, shameful, slid into both worlds. Into the long 20th century, the story changed. In 1905, under a microscope, Fritz Jourdain and Erich Hoffmann saw the germ Treponema pallidum. The organism that had hidden for so long was finally seen. The discovery refrained centuries of confusion. A spiral-shaped bacterium, thin and corkscrew-like, had been the invisible invader. Later, in 1910, Paul Ehrlich, looking for a magic bullet, developed arsvenomine. Salvarsan was the first modern drug that actually attacked the bacterium with some success. Salvarsan wasn't mercury. It didn't taste like copper, and doctors celebrated. But it was hardly gentle. Arsenic compounds had their own toxic effects and needed careful handling. The 20th century brought penicillin, and with it a kind of medical peace treaty. Penicillin's effectiveness in the mid-20th century changed the clinical story of syphilis in ways earlier doctors could hardly have imagined. But these later chapters don't erase the centuries of pain and confusion that shaped bodies and courts. It's important to remember how medical desperation created social meaning. The sweat house and the mercury bath did more than try to cure. They created social rituals of shame and seriousness. Men and women who took guaiacum were marked as clients of a certain kind. They were seen as trying to buy back their virtue. The poor, left without good care, faced isolation and moral judgment. They got neither the expensive guaiacum baths, nor the expensive guaiacum baths, nor the expensive mercury pills. Those who were enslaved,
Colonized or otherwise pushed to the margins often bore the worst of both the disease and the experimental treatments, victims of their jobs, of sexual exploitation, and of the medical exploitation that comes with inequality.
the historical cases, when put together, form a slow, unrelenting pattern. A soldier in 1495 steps off a ship, thinking he's healthy. A king in the mid-16th century, secretly rubbed with mercury before a marriage. In the 17th century, a noblewoman loses children and hears whispers that the pox is in her blood. In the 19th century, an eloquent magistrate slides into what doctors call general paresis, and the court argues over who should rule. Each story is an example of logistics, the movement of people, the use of doctors, the high cost of remedies, the gathering of councils to decide who will lead when the ruler's mind fails. In each case, the disease is less a moral lesson than a practical problem. How to care for the infected, how to hide or reveal their condition, how to pass power without public scandal. And yet, for all the clinical detail and political consequence, the pox remained a private terror. It let people go on with their lives until, suddenly, it didn't. That delay is the cruel genius of the disease. It messed up the idea of cause and effect. A child, born with a collapsed nose years after a lover's night, could be proof of cheating, or simply the living record of an infection whose timing no longer mattered. A ruler's sudden dementia might be called divine punishment, madness, or a family trait. It might, in truth, be neurosyphilis, only showing up in the late stages. Courts and clinics responded with what they had: secrecy, rumors, dramatic cures, brutal treatments. For centuries, mercury and sweat in imported woods formed a chorus of treatments whose harmonies were often off-key and whose solos were performed on bodies that couldn't easily say no. The story leaves us with images that stay with you. A bedroom in a royal palace where a doctor smears ointment on a royal body while courtiers whisper outside. A market in Seville where guaiacum is sold in bundles. A foreign promise wrapped in bark. A hallway in an asylum in the 1850s where once sober clerks stare at a former colleague who now speaks in rambling bows. Full riddles. These are small logistical scenes, not the grand battles history usually likes, but they're the scenes where human fate met knowledge and the demands of the court. And because history is never just about medicine, it's worth thinking about the irony. The very treatments meant to save also branded and punished. A man made to drool from mercury carried both the disease and the mark of his treatment. The medicines were both an attempt at cure and a social label. A noble rubbed with mercury was saved in body only to be shamed in life. The treatments thus became part of the disease's story. The art of medicine, the confidence of the doctor, the showmanship of the cure seller, the real hope of the patient, all folded into politics and created consequences that reached far beyond one body. So the clinical faces of syphilis, from the modest sore to the destruction of the brain, are not just medical events. They are social events. They are social events. They shaped courts, fights over succession, and the lives of the poor. They prompted therapies as dangerous as the disease itself. And in their spectacle, they fed the rumor mill that could destroy reputations. They taught doctors about hidden stages, made them face the limits of their own observation, and finally, centuries later, led science to the spiroche, to arsenic, to the spirochete, to arsenic, and to antibiotics that would make a new world possible, one where the pox could be treated without the harsh cruelty of the past. But history remembers the time in between, the long pre-antibiotic age, when the pox was a social weapon, a medical mystery, and a cause of both slow ruin and sudden political upheaval. In those centuries, the disease taught a sober lesson, that medicine is often practiced in the shadow of politics, and that courts, in their need to keep up appearances and ensure succession, have always been as vulnerable to microbes as the rest of us. The pox could soften a jaw, ruin a nose, rot a mind, and unsettle a throne. It made doctors into witnesses, pharmacists into keepers of secret cures, and kings into patients whose weakness was both a private tragedy and a public logistical problem. It took time for the spirochete to be seen, and in that long wait, the disease wrote itself into the bones of families and the ledgers of power. If you walk the old streets of European cities where palaces still stand, imagine the hallway where a royal doctor kept his bottles, and think of the quiet ledger where names and fees are recorded. There you'll see the logistics, the movement of remedies, the cost of silence, the bribes paid to keep a scandal in the dark. That ledger is one of history's tools. It tells as clearly as an autopsy how a disease that often started with a single, unassuming sore became a force that shaped the fates of courts, the suffering of families, and the evolution of medicine itself. It's a ledger heavy with costs. Physical, moral, political. And it is, in the end, the clearest proof that disease, treatment, rumor, and power have always been tangled together, like two threads in a cloth woven on a feverish night. Sleep on that thought if you must, and know that in history as in medicine, the quiet things, the unseen germs, the tiny sores, the delayed reactions, often matter the most. The pox taught the world the limits of seeing, the dangers of spectacle, and the slow arithmetic of human consequence. It asked for cures that were costly and for names that meant blame. It made kings suspect, courts uneasy, and doctors humble. And for that reason, it belongs to both the clinic and the court, a disease that taught doctors about stages and latency, and taught courtiers how fragile a crown is when the mind fails and silence hides the sickness that drove kings, and sometimes whole realms, toward madness. When Fritz Schaudin and Erich Hoffmann looked through their lenses in a Berlin lab in 1905, what they found didn't look like the moral lesson Europe had long used to explain: venereal suffering. It looked plainly like life, a thin, glistening spiral that moved with a smooth, deliberate motion under a drop of salt water. They were zoologists by training, not priests. And the microscope gave them an answer that sermons and laws had never provided: an organism. Their paper, published that same year, described Spirotita pallida, a delicate corkscrew of glassy threads that, when stained and examined, revealed itself in the moist fluid of primary sores. The discovery, made in the rooms and on the benches of the Institute for Infectious Diseases in Berlin, read like a simple correction to a long-held mistake, but it was anything but simple. For centuries, syphilis had worn many faces: a rash, a sore, madness, a slow wasting, and now, in the quiet lab light, it had a shape. That shape, later renamed Treponema pallidum, as taxonomists tried to fit the world into neater boxes, reframed the argument. No longer just a social problem needing moral instruction or legal force to control. Syphilis now had a visible agent. That visibility wasn't instant gratification. It required new tools and new patience. The organism was fragile outside its human host. It couldn't be grown on ordinary lab media. It didn't take well to the common dyes of the day, but it moved. Its thinness, its graceful spiral, and its movement were visible with dark-field microscopy, a technique known to physicists, but when used on patient samples, seemed almost magical to doctors who had relied for so long on touch, sight, and the art of diagnosis. In that dark, eerie light, the spirochete gleamed like a silver thread against a black background. A doctor could take a scraping from a sore, put it under the microscope, and within minutes see the pathogen glide. In the era before reliable blood tests, Darkfield gave doctors an immediate, bedside certainty that was intoxicating for those exhausted by guesswork. The immediate practical result was modest but important. Darkfield allowed early diagnosis in primary syphilis when antibodies hadn't yet built up in the blood. It let doctors target treatment, clear up doubts, and try for a cure. And it made the microbe visible to the human imagination in a way that a list of symptoms never had. But direct observation had limits. The organism's refusal to grow in the lab meant that bacteriologists couldn't run their usual tests of cause and effect. To prove that the germ wasn't just a passenger in syphilitic sores, researchers turned to what labs used for other stubborn infections: animal models. Rabbits became the experimental stage for this drama. When material from human sores was injected into rabbit testicles, sores formed. When spirochetes were later found in those sores, they were there. These repeated tests showed, awkwardly but importantly, that the spiral and the sickness were not just passing acquaintances, but constant companions. The lab work of the first decade of the 20th century moved like a tide. Emil Leviditti and Hideo Noguchi worked across borders, refining stains and confirming the spirochete's presence in tissues from patients and lab animals. Leviditti's silver stains, among other methods, made it possible to see treponema in fixed tissue samples, helping pathologists in Paris, New York, and beyond connect clinical syndromes to microscopic reality. Noguchi, who worked at the Rockefeller Institute and traveled between New York, Paris, and Tokyo, brought an infectious energy to the job of proving the link, even if some of his later theories were overreaching. What mattered in those years wasn't just who got the credit, but the building of a believable story in which an organism could be seen, tracked, and implicated. The step from seeing to screening happened faster than many expected. If the spirochete could be glimpsed in a sore, maybe the body left a fingerprint elsewhere. An antibody. And August von Wassermann, in another Berlin lab, offered exactly that. In 1906, Wassermann described a complement fixation test that would bear his name and change the logistics of disease control. The Wassermann test was cumbersome by later standards, but revolutionary in its time. You mixed a patient's serum with an antigen made from syphilitic tissue. You added complement. Then you introduced an indicator system. If the patient's antibodies had bound to the antigen, the complement would be used up and wouldn't be available to break down the indicator cells. A lack of breakdown meant a positive result for a disease that until then had been diagnosed by eye and fingertip. A blood test meant that public health officials could look for syphilis without needing an open sore to scrape. It meant that hidden infections, the kind that smoldered in bone and brain and womb without the drama of an obvious sore, could be found. The Wassermann test wasn't perfect. It gave false positives in tuberculosis, in pregnancy, in autoimmune diseases. It gave false negatives in early cases and in late neurosyphilis. Still, like any new technology, it was judged not just by how accurate it was, but by what it made possible. For the first time, governments, hospitals, and charities could think about large-scale screening. They could take blood samples at ports after battles, in clinics, at borders, and estimate how common the disease was. Epidemiology, until then an art with unreliable numbers, became a clearer science. The ability to measure meant the ability to manage. Between the discovery of the spirochete and the early E of blood tests, the way syphilis was controlled changed from local judgment and one-off treatments into systems of tracking and referral. Public health machinery creaked and then moved into place. Notification laws for infectious diseases were passed or strengthened. Specialized venereal disease clinics opened. Medical societies argued about who should control this new technical field. The Rockefeller Foundation and other charities funded clinics and training programs across Europe, Latin America, and parts of Africa and Asia. The language of control entered diplomatic and colonial offices. Here was a disease that could be counted, plotted, and, at least in theory, suppressed. The logic of looking and counting on a national or imperial scale required tests that were simpler and cheaper than the Wassermann complement fixation. That need led to a family of non-treponemal tests that detected regenic antibodies to fats released from damaged cells and from the germ's own membranes. In labs in the United States during the 1940s, scientists at the Venereal Disease Research Laboratory of the U.S. Public Health Service refined antigen preparations that were both practical and easy to scale. The VDRL test, named for the lab, used a cardiolipin cholesterol lecithin antigen in a flocculation assay that was easier to run on many samples. And its cousin, the rapid plasma reagin RPR test, used carbon particles to make the reaction visible to the naked eye. These non-treponemal tests weren't the end of the story. They were the front gate. Positive results were usually confirmed by treponemal-specific tests that later became more sophisticated, like the fluorescent treponemal antibody absorption (FTA-ABS) test in the post-war decades. Still, the arrival of VDRL and RPR changed the logistics of screening. They made it possible to test blood in batches, to check pregnant women routinely, and to quickly sort through populations after displacement and war. Microbiology had done what law and sermon had failed to do. It turned a vague set of symptoms into a measurable, definable enemy. That change rewired public health. Tracking suggested targets. Targets demanded resources. Resources produced programs. Screening programs grew everywhere. in ports and hospitals, in military recruiting stations, at immigration checkpoints, in maternity wards, among sex workers. Contact tracing grew from a moral suggestion into a practical method. Find the infected, test their contacts, treat them. Syphilis, which had once been a slow-moving social drama, entered the world of applied logistics, lists of names, schedules for follow-ups, warehouses of supplies, and clinics whose glass doors opened to long lines. It's important to remember that none of this solved the deeper social reasons why the disease spread, but it did change the calculation. Where there was a test, the organism could be chased. Against that backdrop of visibility and organized control, therapy made its own revolution. Paul Ehrlich, a German Jewish scientist of a different kind, more pen and thought than microscope and scalpel, had long thought of cures as arrows designed with precision. The magic bullet idea was his. Make a chemical that would find and destroy a germ without wrecking the surrounding tissue. To make a bullet, you needed chemistry, patience, and a willingness to test, fail, and test again. In Frankfurt, in the labs of Ehrlich's Institute for Experimental Therapy, chemists and clinicians made compound after compound. The 606 idea, the 610th, the 610th, the 606 and 11th were failures. Not a great record by modern project management standards, but good ground for luck. When a chemist named Alfred Burham and a doctor named Sahachiro Hata, who had come to Ehrlich from Japan, tested the 6/6th agent in the chain of synthesized arsenicals, they found something more than just a pause in their routine. The compound cured infected rabbits. Ehrlich, who kept detailed notebooks and liked his science as orderly as his meals, announced the discovery in 1910. The drug was called arsphenamine. The public would know it as salvarsan. The name was hope and marketing in one, a salve against the arsenic of disease. Salvarsan arrived at a complicated cultural moment. Medical practice in 1910 was still half craft. Doctors valued their own judgment and the occasional dramatic cure. Salvarsan seemed at first like a miracle. It lowered death rates from late-stage disease, slowed its progress, and gave patients years of relief. It gave officials reason to invest in clinics. It let the armies of Europe, at least for a while, deal with the problem of venereal disease without losing the men they needed on the front. But the drug was not the neat, one-shot solution that magic bullet suggested. It was toxic. IV injections of arsenic compounds cause fevers, rashes, liver problems, kidney inflammation, and sometimes sudden death, giving it required skill. The drug had to be freshly made, neutralized, and given in doses that varied from doctor to doctor. Fake and poor quality versions sometimes circulated. The drug company Hocht in Germany became the main supplier, and the logistics of making, packaging, and shipping an unstable chemical before modern quality control were enormous. Ehrlich's success, however, changed medical practice in ways that lasted beyond the drug itself. The very idea that a molecule could be aimed at a germ created a new industry. Specialist venereal disease clinics grew, not just to give salvarsan, but to watch for side effects, to test and retest patients, to keep records, and to make sure patients came back on time. Treatment became an organized event rather than a private matter, a public ritual of sorts, done under the watch of public health doctors, city officials, and sometimes the military. Governments before World War II often ran or supported such clinics in Britain, France, Germany, the United States, and in colonial administrations. A state's involvement with sexually transmitted diseases became a normal part of keeping order. The Rockefeller Foundation poured money into such programs around the world, teaching doctors and public health workers how to give arsenical therapy, how to track contacts, and how to record follow-up blood tests. Those programs were practical and sometimes paternalistic. They gave more people access to therapy while leaving others out. They built a system of reporting and registration that, in turn, created social stigma or administrative neglect. The drug era had politics as well as chemistry. Still, there was no denying that survival improved for many, and that the worst, late-stage problems of syphilis were at least partly prevented. Medicine tasted victory, even if the victory was mixed. Then came the quiet user, A mold, Alexander Fleming, had noticed penicillin's ability to kill bacteria in London in 1928. But it was only in the early 1940s that penicillin, purified, concentrated, and made in large amounts, became a weapon in ordinary hands. Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, and their Oxford colleagues turned Fleming's lab curiosity into a medical tool. American drug companies, with wartime urgency and government contracts, built production lines. By the mid-1940s, penicillin was being shipped in vials across oceans. The Allied militaries were among the first to benefit. Where salvarsan had been complicated and only partly effective, penicillin was clear and strong. It could be given as a shot, and for many forms of syphilis, it cured. The logistics of wartime production and distribution meant the drug reached huge numbers of people quickly: soldiers, sailors, and many civilians in countries with industrial capacity. What followed in the years just after World War II was a public health campaign with a speed that had once been reserved for emergencies. In Britain, the Ministry of Health made penicillin part of wartime and post-war venereal disease control, offering free diagnosis and treatment through clinics and family doctors. In the United States, the Public Health Service, the Military Medical Corps, and state health departments worked together on mass screening drives, contact tracing, and treatment programs on an unprecedented scale. Penicillin wasn't just a new drug. It changed the whole administrative response to syphilis. Mass treatment campaigns were organized in factories, in neighborhoods, in hospitals. Prenatal screening became a public health priority because congenital syphilis could be prevented if the pregnant person got treated in time. Blood banks started routine blood tests to make sure transfusions were safe. The tools of measurement, now paired with a reliable cure, let health services set goals and see progress. An exciting prospect. The drop in cases was dramatic where resources and political will were present. In just a few years, syphilis rates fell sharply in military populations and in towns and cities that had access to the new drug. In urban clinics in London and New York, whole groups of patients who might once have faced permanent disability were now curable. The mental picture of the pox as a slow, inevitable doom gave way to a more practical picture of clinics and vials. Stories of individual recovery multiplied into national statistics. Fewer congenital cases, fewer hospitalizations for late-stage disease, less neurosyphilis in asylums and wards. But the story was as uneven as human infrastructure. The technology, the disposable syringe, the sterile vial, the factory capable of making penicillin in large amounts, was not spread evenly around the world. Wealthy nations and their militaries got the benefits first. The rural poor, the colonized, and many marginalized communities waited or were overlooked. The darkest example of this inequality in the United States was the Tuskegee study. It was a public health service experiment begun in 1932 in which hundreds of black men with syphilis were observed for decades without adequate treatment, even after penicillin became the standard cure. The men were told they were getting free health care. In truth, researchers kept the cure from them. When the story came out in 1972, it revealed a moral and institutional failure that stained public health authority and showed how the distribution of medical benefits could be shaped by race, class, and power. Elsewhere, colonial administrations sometimes prioritized treatment for European settlers and so hold years while screening or treating local people only when politically convenient. In many poor countries, the lack of drugs, the shortage of trained health workers, and other pressing health needs meant that penicillin's promise took years or decades to become real. The social consequences of this medical success were not all good. The idea that syphilis could be cured with one shot changed public messages about sex. In some places it led to carelessness. If a disease could be fixed with medicine, the moral warnings lost some of their power, and prevention education faced new challenges. In other places, however, the state doubled down on surveillance, premarital testing, immigration screening, and required reporting became tools of government as much as of health promotion. The story of syphilis shifted from one of moral correction to one of medical management. And with that shift came more bureaucracy, and for some, less privacy. For doctors and microbiologists, the penicillin era was a validation. It proved that finding the germ and then finding a drug that hurts the germ more than the person could be a general strategy. It pushed antibiotic research, encouraged mass drug production, and made people imagine that infection, like war or engineering, could be solved by industrial methods. The pox retreated in places with resources and political commitment, and that retreat shaped sexual health policy for decades. Where penicillin was abundant, congenital syphilis rates fell. Where it was scarce, mothers continued to have babies with a preventable disease. That uneven geography of success meant that even though the mid-20th century saw a real drop in syphilis in many industrialized countries, the organism survived where health systems were weak. Medical success also brought new scientific frustrations. Treponema pallidum stubbornly refused to grow in lab media, and a vaccine remained, and still remains, elusive. The germ's ability to hide in latent forms and to reach protected places like the central nervous system made treatment and our understanding of immunity complicated. The tools that had made detection and cure possible, microscopy, blood tests, antibiotics, didn't magically answer every biological question. Labs still held mysteries, even after the vials had been shipped. When historians look back on this period, the picture is complex, a story of success that is also a list of limits. The discovery of the spirochete turned a mysterious illness into a microbial fact. Blood tests turned clinical suspicion into a program. Salvarsan taught the world that molecules could be shaped into weapons against disease. Penicillin turned that lesson into a full-scale reshaping of public health. The scale of change was industrial and administrative, as much as medical. Factories changed to make drugs. Clinics grew under city governments. Wartime logistics shifted to peacetime health campaigns, and millions of shots were given in kitchens and hospitals, in barracks and maternity wards. There's a certain dark, sober humor in remembering how a shy, winding bacterium once hid in the folds of human tissue until a pair of eyes with a lens and a question asked to see it. How a chemist's patient search for compounds produced a toxic but life-saving arsenic drug. And how, finally, an accidental mold gave up its secrets just at the moment when industry could use them. The pox had been both stubborn and theatrical. It had created whole moral economies and had been used as a parable. Microbiology and pharmaceuticals remade those economies, replacing sermons with logistics, vials with verdicts. The drop in cases in the mid-century was therefore less a victory than a reorganization. The disease was no longer the same public enemy because public health armed WPA, if microscopes, blood tests, and antibiotics could contain and treat it on an unprecedented scale. Even as cases fell, the institutions that had been built remained. Clinics that had been set up to give salvarsan and then penicillin grew into sexual health services, into maternal and child health programs, into departments of epidemiology that would later face new STIs with their own tools. The social lessons were also hard ones. The uneven spread of cures, the ethics broken in the name of research, the sometimes naive hope that one drug would end centuries of complex interaction between biology and behavior. These lessons stayed with medicine and public health. They became part of how societies decide whose lives to value quickly and how to share the means of cure. So in the long aftertaste of the story, the century's arc, from a spiral seen in a Berlin lab to armies of syringes and mass campaigns and a mold-turned medicine, there is both a lullaby and a warning. The lullaby is that a terrible, ancient disease was made visible, measurable, and treatable. Mothers were spared, soldiers came home, and countless lives were changed for the better. The warning is that science doesn't share its benefits evenly. That discovery can be as much an occasion for injustice as for relief, and that the infrastructure of health, the microscopes, the labs, the shipping lines, the clinics, matters as much as the chemistry. The pox that once seemed to wear the face of fate was in the electric light of the 20th century, reduced to a problem of logistics, detection, and drugs, not gone, not ignored, managed, and managed as human things are, with all the generosity and carelessness that human institutions can offer. They arrived in a small Alabama county, with faith in the promise of free healthcare, and stayed for 40 years in a study that never meant to cure them. In the summer of 1932 again. But the United States Public Health Service, working with the Tuskegee Institute and local health officials in Macon County, recruited 600 poor rural men under the gentle-sounding label of treatment for bad blood. Of those, 399 were later identified as having latent syphilis, and 201 were uninfected controls. The project, named in bureaucratic prose the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male, was sold as charity, as science, as a public good. The name itself carried the awkward honesty of government authority and the racist assumptions of its time. It hid for decades a deliberate refusal to treat and an institutional story of lies in which medical authority, scientific curiosity, and racial contempt met and worked together. The logistics of the lie were not slapdash. The study had structure, budgets, travel routes, and a steady hand. Field workers, public health nurses, and local recruiters walked the dirt roads and back lanes of Macon County, knocking on weathered doors under the pretense of health exams. The most famous among them was Eunice Rivers Laurie, a black nurse who served as the steady link between the men and the government. She made the appointments, gave the tests, and kept the men enrolled. She was a human hinge between trust and betrayal. Her role complicates the moral picture. She believed she was doing good. She also became part of a project that denied her patients the cure for their disease. The study used mobile clinics and small-town hospital rooms, little campaigns of surface-level care, and the language of paternalism, observational study, natural history, to justify ongoing neglect. For 2 decades, the study continued even as a cure became available. In the 1940s, when penicillin emerged as a cheap, reliable, and sure cure for syphilis, the men were not offered it. The project leaders argued that treating them would ruin their ability to watch the natural course of the disease. That argument sounds grotesque now, but it fit a scientific mindset that valued data over people and assumed that certain groups could be observed without the ethical duties owed to other subjects. The wartime urgency of venereal disease control. After all, the Army needed healthy soldiers, and the post-war growth of federal public health resources made the refusal even more glaring. The study continued while the rest of the country embraced mass penicillin treatment, while public health departments ran campaigns to wipe out venereal disease. And while veterans came home with the rights and benefits of military service, the reasons behind the Tuskegee study were tangled. There was the complacency and arrogance of mid-20th century scientific medicine. There was the casualness of a bureaucracy that could treat an entire rural population as objects of study rather than partners in care. And there was a deep racial blind spot. There was also the social context of Jim Crow. Segregated hospitals, separate wards, and a long history of black bodies being used for medical education and experimentation. From the trade in cadavers to live demonstrations, the pattern was there. The men were poor, many illiterate, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. A suspicion the recruiters used with quiet skill. They were told they would get free exams, meals, and burial insurance. They were not told that their diagnosis would be kept from them, that even after an effective cure was known, they would be given placebos, limited care for symptoms and diagnostic tests, without the choice to refuse. The story came to light, not from a brave whistleblower inside Tuskegee's walls, but from a venereal disease investigator, with a conscience working within the public health service. Peter Buxton, a young PHS social worker, had been troubled for years. He asked his superiors to act in 1966 and again in 1968. When his pleas were ignored, he went to the press. It was John Heller of the Washington Star who printed the story on a summer morning in July of 1972, and the nation was jolted. The headlines hit like thunder. Poor black men had been lied to, denied treatment, and left to suffer for decades so that science could collect its data. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare formed panels. Education and Welfare formed panels. The story forced public servants to resign. Lawsuits were filed, and the clinical world finally looked at itself. There were numbers that shocked the public. 600 men enrolled, dozens of wives infected, children born with congenital syphilis, the slow loss of health and life over 40 years. There was also the personal toll of betrayal. Men who had trusted a government that talked of healing found only neglect. Husbands whose sickness passed to their wives. Children who carried the physical and social marks of congenital infection. In legal terms, the federal government was forced to answer. A class action suit led to a 1974 settlement that gave the survivors and their families a lifetime of medical benefits, burial payments, and a symbolic $10 million split among them. In political terms, the end of the study sent ripples outward, sparking a set of reforms that would change how human subjects were treated in the United States. The changes that followed didn't fall from the sky. They came from anguished debate, from white papers, from the work of ethicists, and from a public demand that medicine could no longer govern itself without democratic limits. The National Research Act of 1974 created the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, which in turn produced the Belmont Report in 1979. The Belmont Report laid out 3 ethical principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Each phrase was a small moral lighthouse aimed at the dark waters that had swallowed Tuskegee. Institutional review boards, or IRBs, became required for federally funded research, a bureaucratic guardrail that demanded informed consent, risk-benefit assessment, and ongoing oversight. A common rule, a set of federal rules for human subject research that took shape in the following decades, built these ideas into practice. The field of bioethics, once marginal, moved into the mainstream, teaching generations of doctors and researchers that do no harm was not just a worn-out saying, but a real, consent-based duty. Yet the work of repair ran into deeper problems. Apologies were issued, including a presidential apology in 1997 by Bill Clinton, an event both solemn and mournful, where survivors were brought to the White House and the nation heard its own mistakes named aloud. The apology didn't erase the memory or its effects. Trust, once broken, is slow to heal. Studies across the late 20th and early 21st centuries measured the results. Lower participation by Black Americans in clinical trials, heightened suspicion of medical authority, and less use of preventive health services among some groups. Economists and public health researchers even tried to count the effects. A study by Alsan and Wanamaker in 2018 suggested that the Tuskegee revelations led to a drop in life expectancy among Black men that lasted for years and to less use of public health services where suspicion had been planted deepest. The consequences were not just ideas, they were real, affecting vaccination campaigns, organ donation rates, and the willingness to be screened. In moments of epidemic, HIV/AIDS, H1N1, COVID-19, the shadow of Tuskegee reappeared, shaping conversations about trust and the moral duties of public health to the communities it serves. The legacy of Tuskegee also forced a rethinking of scientific stories about who deserves protection. The Belmont principle of justice demanded that the burdens and benefits of research be shared fairly, a rebuke to a past where the poor and marginalized were too often asked to take the risks. Yet questions remain about how well those principles are put into practice. Are IRBs diverse enough? Do consent forms mean the same thing to someone with little schooling? How does one rebuild trust across generations? The answers are messy, slow, and often incomplete. Community-based participatory research, efforts to include local voices in study design, and rules that researchers must share their financial interests are among the practical steps taken to make amends. But the emotional ledger, anger, sorrow, distrust, remains. Medical institutions have tried to remember Tuskegee as a cautionary tale. Communities remember it as a real injustice. Both memories are correct. From the specific evil of Tuskegee, the story spreads outward into a broader history of syphilis and the human movements that carried it. Disease is drawn to motion, and war is motion in its most concentrated form. Soldiers marching, ships crossing oceans, colonial officials and traders meeting in port cities. These were the paths of venereal disease. In the long 19th century, campaigns and imperial projects moved men, and with them, microbes, across continents. Napoleon's armies carried the pox across Europe. Steamships sped up connections that before the industrial age had been more local. By the 20th century, the two world wars made venereal disease a problem of military readiness and social order. Military responses were practical and relentlessly logistical. Armies and navies turned their attention to STD control because healthy troops meant effective fighting forces. The British Admiralty, the French Army, and the United States military, all SAF, set up systems of prevention, inspection, and treatment. Brothels were regulated or banned, depending on policy. Where regulation ruled, governments often set up licensed houses under watch, believing that controlled prostitution in camp brothels was better than unregulated contact. Where prohibition ruled, secret sex increased, and so did infection. The U.S. Army in World War I created education programs, regular checks, and treatment stations near bases. The War Department handed out condoms, always controversial, sometimes in secret, and ran moral reform campaigns that mixed hygiene with moralizing language. War demanded hygiene as a matter of strategy, and science answered with organizational skill. Venereal disease hospitals, mobile testing stations, prevention centers at transport hubs, and tracking networks to watch infection rates among troops. Colonial encounters made these dynamics stronger. Empires were not just political arrangements. They were systems of movement. People, goods, and germs all traveled along imperial routes. In the British, French, Dutch, German, and later Japanese colonies, local sex markets were watched, regulated, and often forced to serve the needs of empire. Port cities, Lagos, Kolkata, Hanoi, Manila, Dar es Salaam, became meeting points for sailors, soldiers, merchants, and local sex workers. Colonial governments set up public health measures that were both practical and sharply unfair. Luck hospitals, inherited from British criminal law traditions, became tools of control. Women suspected of sex work could be held, examined, and confined without their consent. These measures claimed to protect men from disease, but in practice they targeted women's bodies and freedom. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the British Empire in the 19th century, meant to protect service members and sailors from STIs, sparked fierce debates about civil rights and gender equality in Britain, leading to their repeal in the late 1800s. In the colonies, though, similar measures often continued under different names, enforced by the military and police with little chance for those held to fight back. Public health surveillance in the colonies carried a flavor of paternalism and race. Medical officers often wrote about local populations as sources of infection, their words showing both fear and disdain. Treatment was clearly unequal. Soldiers got priority for prevention and care. Colonized women, especially sex workers, bore the worst of the coercive measures. The logic was not just medical, it was imperial. A healthy garrison kept white rule in place. At the same time, local communities sometimes used the new tools of public health for their own ends, seeking care in colonial hospitals, asking for services, and using hygiene as a way to argue for a place in civic life. The tensions were constant. In French West Africa, for example, regulating prostitution aimed to protect colonial officials and troops, but it also created a market of licensed brothels and a class of sexually exploited women under police control. In German Southwest Africa and other territories, colonized people faced forced medical checks and quarantines that added to existing injustices. The ethical fallout from these wartime and imperial policies was deep. Public health measures that targeted and watched specific groups, women sex workers, colonized communities, left a lasting lack of trust. Many governments justified force in the name of national security or public order, and those justifications came easily to later officials looking for quick solutions. That's the darker math of empire. The calculus of protection often put the bodies of the powerful first. The social consequences were severe. Sex work, already stigmatized in European cities as a social problem, became, in colonial settings, a tool of racial control. The moral panics that followed soldiers' health produced laws and institutions that linked sexual difference to racial hierarchies. These measures did reduce infection rates in some places, especially after penicillin arrived in the 1940s, but they did so at the cost of civil liberties and respect for people. War also brought more subtle forms of cultural anxiety. Public talk linked syphilis to moral decay, recklessness, and the threat of social collapse. A soldier coming home with an STD was not just physically hurt. He was a symbol of failure, a text to be read about the health of the nation. Governments made pamphlets, posters, and films to teach people about the dangers of venereal disease. Slogans urging restraint, the clinic as a place of redemption, the hospital as a civic theater of repair. The messages were often moralizing, aimed as much at controlling behavior as at encouraging medical care. And in many imperial settings, the messages reinforced racial hierarchies. Disease was tied to native, sexual practices, while the modern soldier or colonial official was shown as a victim needing protection. As the world moved into the mid-20th century, the scene shifted again. Penicillin, widely used after 1945, turned syphilis from a long-term scourge into a curable disease. Military logistics embraced mass treatment. Public health strategies moved toward prenatal screening, community clinics, and antibiotics spread through national health systems. In former colonies, new independent states wrestled with the legacies of surveillance and inequality, even as they adopted Western models of public health. The 19th century specter of the pox, which had been used to justify empire and policing, slowly faded from daily life, but its cultural shadow stayed long and flexible. That cultural shadow shaped art and literature, even as doctors wrote scientific books. Syphilis has been a recurring theme in the European imagination since the Renaissance, a disease that could be seen, named, and then used as a metaphor for sin, moral decay, or racial decline. The Italian poet and doctor Girolamo Fracastoro, in a long instructional poem published in the early 16th century called Syphilis Civi Morbus Gallicus, gave the disease a name and a face. Syphilis, a mythical shepherd, turning a medical condition into an allegory. Renaissance writers and satirists followed. A single sore could be a moral lesson, a physical sign that stood for vice. In early modern broadsides, the French disease became a handy national insult. Nations named the pox after their neighbors. The Italians blamed the French blamed the Neapolitans, and so on. A verbal spread of xenophobia wrapped around a microbial fact. The visual culture of syphilis appeared in the pages of medical atlases and in the galleries of modern art. 19th century syphilographers like Philippe Ricord and Jean-Alfred Fournier made clinical plates, carefully drawn gammata, skin rashes, and bone lesions that entered the public imagination through textbooks and medical lectures. These images were clinical, and because they could be copied, they taught. They also became symbolic. The clinical photograph, taken from a person's life and placed on a page, was a powerful sign. It let doctors turn suffering into an object and made the disease clear in stark, often damning terms. The language of degeneration, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, made syphilis even more of a symbol. As scientists and social thinkers debated heredity and national strength, venereal disease was said to drive decline. The French psychiatrist Benedict Morel and later theorists argued that syphilitic infection weakened people physically and morally over generations. Max Nordau's writings on degeneration in the 1890s reached a wide public, and his arguments linked disease and culture. The eugenics movement took up these fears, listing venereal disease among the reasons to control reproduction. That thinking moved from words to action in the worst cases. Forced sterilization laws, marriage restrictions, and surveillance measures were all justified in part by the language of infection and heredity. The moralizing of disease, then, fed legal and political actions that had lasting effects on privacy and reproductive rights. Artists responded in ways both direct and symbolic. Some, like the Norwegian painter Edvard Munch, made illness a sign of deep unease. Munch's own illness, he contracted syphilis in the first decade of the 1905, left marks on his life and work, a focus on decay, of work, a focus on decay, on the fragility of the body, on anxious portraits that seemed to breathe with the disease's discomfort. His canvases, with their strained colors and tense faces, capture a modern obsession with inner decay. Other artists use syphilis as a metaphor. The decadent poets and painters of fin de siècle Europe turned the pox into a symbol of decline, a marker of an age that swung between the thrill of sensation and the fear of moral collapse. In fiction and theater, syphilis gave plots and pathos. It could be the social stain that ruins a family, the scandal that exposes a gentleman, or the slow moral rot that justifies exile and tragedy. The stage and early movies were quick to use the theme. In the early 20th century, plays and films about venereal disease were part of a broader genre of social hygiene drama that aimed to inform and shock. Eugène Briot's controversial play, Les Avariés, 1901, translated as Damaged Goods and staged widely in the English-speaking world, made the social effects of syphilis a public spectacle. But, insisting on the need for sex education and honest talk, the play's movie versions in the 1910s and 1920s created a visual language for moral teaching. Close-ups of hospital wards, the stark geometry of anatomy drawings, and the grave faces of doctors explaining the results of unprotected sex. These works walked a line between public service and moralizing sensationalism. They aimed to reduce infection by scaring audiences. Satire and caricature, too, used the pox as a tool of mockery. Punch cartoons and other late 19th century magazines made fun of politicians and public figures by hinting at venereal disease, using it to suggest private vice behind public posturing. The disease became a shorthand for hypocrisy. A public leader who preached morality could be ridiculed as hiding his own sins, his pox an ironic comment on his political double life. The power of the metaphor lay in its double role as both medical fact and moral symbol, a bodily sign that could be read in the language of values. In colonies and imperial cities, cultural images of syphilis took on local flavors. Medical photography and colonial hospitals produced pictures of sores and deformities that were then used in debates in Europe about the costs and dangers of empire. Travel stories and ethnographies sometimes mixed local sex practices with disease rates, creating stereotypes and social distance. The colonial press, newspapers in Bombay, Dar es Salaam, and Manila printed notices about contagious disease laws that served as both public health announcements and tools of social control. The result was a mix of images and texts in which disease and difference were constantly written over one another. By the mid-20th century, as penicillin changed medical practice, but for Maha, the cultural meaning of syphilis shifted from inevitable moral decay to treatable illness, and later to complex chronic conditions like neurosyphilis that still haunted medical talk. The specter of congenital syphilis kept alive social fears about heredity and motherhood. Prenatal screening programs were praised as public health achievements and criticized for their potential to shame women. In modern literature, references to syphilis often look back to the long history of taboo and shame, rather than forward to a purely medical story. Writers and artists use its history to ask questions about memory, secrecy, and the body politic. The lasting power of syphilis in the cultural imagination also comes from the disease's own changing nature. A disease that can mark the skin, damage the bone, twist the mind, and then stay hidden for years is a powerful source of metaphor. It can stand for sin, for mental torment, for a nation in decline, for colonial harm. Colonial harm. It can be the tool a story uses to show the moral cost of empire or the private collapse of a family. That literary quality has been both a curse and a resource. A curse, because metaphor can deepen stigma, turning patients into lessons rather than people. A resource because it has forced writers and artists to pay attention, sometimes with painful honesty, to the human results of policy. If there is an ironic twist, it is that the very forms used to stigmatize syphilis, images of sores, stories of infection, calls for separation, have also given us a language for compassion. The clinic's photograph, once used to turn people into objects, can in different hands become testimony. The pamphlet that warned of sin can, in another light, be a document of social concern. The historian who reads these objects carefully can trace not only the politics of exclusion, but also the efforts at care that grew from them. After Tuskegee, the field of medical ethics has tried to build those forms of care into law and practice: consent, respect, accountability. After the wars and the age of empire, public health has led, often clumsily, sometimes nobly, to balance large-scale interventions with individual rights. Art and literature, for their part, have kept alive the memory that disease is not just a medical problem, but a human story with moral and artistic dimensions. So the parks move through metropole and colony, through barracks and brothels, through pamphlets and pictures, and into the quiet rooms of bedside care, where the final accounting often took place. It became, in short order, a medical condition, a moral picture, and a cultural metaphor. Each of these roles strengthened the others. The state's interest in controlling disease became a tool of social power. Art turned clinical sores into moral allegory. Scientific practice, when cut off from ethics, caused harms whose echoes lasted for generations. Yet from those echoes came reforms, laws, and reports, boards, and ethics committees that tried, imperfectly, to make amends and to prevent it from happening again. In the slow hours when scholars look through archives and artists reshape old images, the history of syphilis offers a strange kind of teaching. It shows the pleasures and dangers of medical certainty, the risks of seeing groups of people as just material for study, and the cruel efficiency with which fear can be used to justify control. It also teaches about the power of story, how a disease can be named, and how that naming becomes a tool of power. The pox, we learn, is not just a microbe. It is a mirror held up to society, reflecting our fears and our cruelties, our bureaucratic genius and our ethical failures. It has driven kings to madness, shocked governments, and inspired artists. But above all, it has demanded the careful work of repair, the slow, patient effort of rebuilding trust, of insisting on consent, and of remembering that the true purpose of medicine is the care of people, not the satisfaction of scientific curiosity. And so we turn, not with triumph, but with quiet attention, from those early betrayals and colonial logic to the long work of memory. Tuskegee speaks to the urgent need for honesty in medicine. The wars and empires of the modern era teach us how policy can both protect and oppress. And the artists and writers across the centuries remind us that disease lives not only in bodies, but in stories. Each strand of this history is braided with the others, tightly enough that pulling one pulls at all of them. The lesson is simple and harsh. Public health must be humane, science must be accountable, and cultural memory must never let us forget the human faces behind the clinical charts. Only then can the pox stop being a political tool and become, instead, a chapter in the long story of how societies learned to care. Across the 19th and into the 20th century, states tried to turn fear into architecture and venereal disease into paperwork. They built legal systems, as if law could fence an infection, like a garden. In Paris, with its iron street lamps and ink-stained ledgers, kept by city police, regulation became routine. From the Napoleonic era onwards, city officials kept lists of registered women, stamped them, called them for medical checks, and turned bodies into records, so that doctors and clerks could look at a card and imagine the epidemic under control. The Misen's closes should be remembered not as quaint curiosities, but as the living edge of a public health philosophy. Control the supply, watch the bodies on display, treat them when needed, and keep soldiers and citizens safe. That system lasted a surprisingly long time. It wasn't until 1946, pushed by reformers like Martha Richard, that France formally closed many of its regulated brothels, ending a system that had been in place for a century and a half. Across the English Channel, the mood was different, but no less focused on law. The British Contagious Diseases Acts, passed in 1864 and expanded in 1866 and 1869, let police and military authorities detain and medically examine women in garrison towns. The logic was simple and blunt: keep the men fit to fight and the empire running. The law reached into the bodies of women who lived near army bases. Wartime prevention wrapped in peacetime power. The acts sparked a fierce moral and political backlash, led by Josephine Butler and the Ladies' National Association for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts. They argued that the laws set a double standard by targeting women, not their clients, with invasive exams and detention. They insisted that public health without civil rights was empty, and that the state had no right to use health as an excuse to police women's bodies. The movement finally saw the acts repealed in 1886, a hard-won reminder that public health and moralism can clash, and that sometimes the law has to be pushed back. The colonial empires took up these themes with a bureaucrat's seal. In British India, in French North Africa, in the ports of the Ottoman Mediterranean, and in the treaty ports of China, colonial administrations set up inspection systems and licensed districts, often saying they were protecting troops and trade. In Shanghai, Bombay, and Algiers, city and military officials hired doctors, appointed police surgeons, and used registration to separate the dangerous classes from the rest. The words were about hygiene. The practice was about control. Local women, migrants, and the poor found themselves at the meeting point of health regulation and imperial order. Their lives were made into inspection reports that traveled from a local clinic to a colonial office half a world away. When the Great War reshaped power and movement, the legal tools of control hardened into organized campaigns. Governments feared that venereal disease would hurt armies more than any cannon. The United Kingdom, France, the United States, and other powers moved to suppress what they called a social menace. The British Defence of the Realm Act gave military authorities the right to limit prostitution near camps. The French army set up regulated brothels for its troops. In the United States, wartime mobilization created the so-called American Plan, a name that sounds bureaucratic and acted coercively. Women suspected of prostitution near military camps could be arrested, medically checked, and held under funds from the Chamberlain-Cahn Act of 1918. Civilian and military leaders believed they were protecting soldiers and the nation. But the law's teeth bit hardest into women's freedom, especially immigrant, poor, and working-class women who couldn't afford lawyers or public sympathy. Ellis Island's revolving doors were another piece of the legal structure. From the late 19th century, immigration stations did checks meant to keep out, detain, or deport people with visible or suspected disease, likely to become a public charge, and infectious disease were phrases that became legal filters. Immigrants, often poor and desperate for work, were stopped at harbors and train stations and opened to inspection. A chest X-ray could be an unyielding verdict. A doctor's note at the border could be a sentence. Medical checks were meant to protect the host population. In practice, they also built hierarchies of worth and shaped migration in ways that left a legacy of distrust. Lock hospitals, institutions whose very name sounds like a lock, and which first appeared in Britain in the mid-18th century, became one of the key tools of venereal regulation. They offered care, but at the price of confinement. Governments and cities set aside buildings for those judged contagious. They hired medical officers whose job was often just containment. These hospitals were not always prisons in the legal sense, but for many held there, they felt like prisons. The white walls, the smell of bleach, the hospital gown that erased identity as surely as a police uniform. The law equated risk with stigma. A doctor's signature could order detention. The stamp of public health authority could limit freedom. Beyond detention lay criminalization. In many places, sex work and spreading venereal disease became crimes. In others, officials used laws about vagrancy, public decency, and transportation to punish behaviors tied to sex and poverty. The Mann Act in the United States, 1910, aimed at stopping interstate sex trafficking. Was sometimes used against consensual relationships as much as against actual trafficking, showing how moral panic can create laws whose reach extends into private life. There were other legal tools, too. Deporting migrant women found to have venereal disease, civil commitment laws used to hospitalize infected people, and the growth of police powers during wartime that made medical detention easier and less open to court review. These legal frameworks were rarely neutral about gender. They were clearly enforced along gender lines and often designed that way. Men, the clients, the soldiers, the foreigners who paid for sex, were more often tolerated or ignored. their bodies free from the same regular checks. Women, especially the poor, the working see.
Lass, the migrant, the black or indigenous women carried the burden of proof against the state.
In the United Kingdom, the Contagious Diseases Acts were applied to women around garrison towns, but not to the male soldiers, whose behavior created the problem. In the United States, the American plan held thousands of women, most of them immigrant and poor. In colonial settings, racial differences made things worse. A white soldier's access to local women might be quietly accepted while those women were watched, licensed, or confined. The law, in short, became a tool for sorting people according to moral and racial hierarchies under the cover of health protection. Where law met medicine, moralism, sometimes, wore the doctor's white coat. The social hygiene movement, growing in the early 20th century in the United States and Europe, mixed sex education and public health with a reformer's zeal and sometimes a patronizing moral tone. Reformers urged sexual restraint, hygiene, regulation of prostitution, and education for young men. They also stirred up fears about white slavery and the corruption of youth. Public health and moral reform fed each other and sometimes justified harsh policies. The logic of containment, inspection, detention, forced treatment could be dressed up as science, while in practice it protected social order and class interests. That protection was often an illusion. The history of legal responses to syphilis shows repeated tensions between the stated goals of public health, reducing disease, suffering, and death, and the use of policing and punishment that often broke trust and got in the way of effective care. Systems that relied on force and contempt pushed sick people into the shadows. People avoided clinics for fear of arrest, deportation, or public shame. Communities whose trust had been broken by heavy-handed health policing were harder to reach with the prevention messages. The very effort to make illness visible through lists, records, and required policies sometimes made it harder to cure politically. The ethical costs of that loss of trust were not abstract. They are stamped into the 20th century, with ugly clarity in two American episodes that still haunt public health memory. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, begun in 1932 by the U.S. Public Health Service and allowed to continue for 40 years, withheld proper treatment from hundreds of black men with syphilis so that the natural course of the disease could be watched. The study continued even after penicillin became widely available in the 1940s, and the men and their families suffered needless illness and death. The experiment broke trust in institutions and created a moral wound that generations have tried to heal. It led to public apologies and to stricter rules for research involving people. In the 1940s, another chapter of misuse happened in Guatemala, where American researchers deliberately infected prisoners, hospital patients, and sex workers to test treatments. When the story came to light decades later, it caused outrage, congressional hearings, and formal apologies from U.S. officials in 2010. These cases teach with brutal clarity that public health without consent and without respect for people can become cruelty in a white coat, and that the wounds from such betrayals are both medical and civic. These are not just old stories, they are living legacies. Today's public health practice still carries the mark of those systems. Mandatory reporting, police working with health officials, and sometimes a leftover willingness to put control over partnership. In many places, the law still makes certain sexual behaviors or passing on disease a crime. In others, the legal structures that grew from the age of regulation shape the logic of modern surveillance, publicly. All systems that inherit a path carved by suspicion must work actively to unlearn the habits of policing and to rebuild trust, because the people most likely to refuse testing or to avoid prenatal care, the marginalized, the migrant, the poor, are often the ones the old legal orders targeted first. If law and moralism tried to seal the world from the pox with stamps and laws, science worked its patient way under the microscope and in the lab. The medicine of syphilis is itself a small, careful drama. Microscopes and reagents, blood test curves and spinal taps, clinical trials and the slow unfolding of pharmacology. The diagnostic tools that doctors use today grew from 19th century curiosity and 20th century curiosity and 20th century ingenuity. Dark-field microscopy, which let clinicians see the corkscrew shape of Treponema pallidum directly, from a sore was once a frontline tool in clinics where the light was good and the pathologist had a steady hand. Its accuracy is excellent, but it needs fresh material, training, and an open sore, luxuries not always available in poor or remote places. Blood tests became the common language.
Two families of tests: non-treponemal assays like the VDRL and RPR, and treponemal assays like the FTAAAS, TPPA, and newer enzyme immunoassays. Two different jobs. Non-treponemal tests are good for screening and for seeing how treatment is working, because the levels rise and fall. Treponemal tests, once positive, often stay positive for life, so they mark past infection as well as present. The traditional method, screening with a non-treponemal test and confirming with a treponemal test, still makes sense in many clinical settings. The reverse method, screening with an automated treponemal test and then confirming with a non-treponemal test, has been adopted widely for lab efficiency, but it can find old treated infections and create confusion in interpretation. Doctors have to read blood tests like a weather map. Patterns matter more than single points. The prozone phenomenon, where very high antibody levels can cause a false negative on a non-treponemal test, is a reminder that the immune system can complicate its own diagnosis. Labs have to be alert and know when to dilute and retest. Molecular methods have come into use too. Polymerase chain reaction, PCR on fluid from a sore or a swab, can give direct evidence of treponemal DNA and is very useful in early infection and in tracking the germ's spread. Whole genome sequencing of Treponema pallidum is now a research tool that can help trace transmission chains and find mutations linked to drug resistance. That's not just academic, it's practical. The early hope for oral antibiotics, especially azithromycin, a single dose by mouth instead of a shot, was attractive, especially in places where intramuscular penicillin was hard to give. But the bacterium has been quick to adapt. Mutations in the 23S gene, changes at positions often called A20, 58G or A20, 58G or A20, 59G in the lab, appeared in the early 2000s and spread, leading to clinical failures of azithromycin in many places and pushing that drug to the back shelf for most syphilis treatment. Macrolide resistance is now a global problem in many groups. The lesson is simple: convenience can breed resistance. Penicillin remains the foundation of syphilis treatment. For early syphilis, a single shot of benzathine penicillin has been the standard for decades. For late latent or unknown duration disease, multiple weekly doses are needed. Neurosyphilis requires IV therapy. Aqueous crystalline penicillin given over many days to reach the spinal fluid at levels that kill the bacteria. These regimens are not just protocol. They reflect centuries of evidence that only injected penicillin reliably clears the germ from protected places in the body. That biological fact creates an ethical duty. In pregnant women, preventing congenital infection is the most urgent goal. Our penicillin is irreplaceable. Steps to safely give penicillin to pregnant women who are allergic exist precisely because no other drug has penicillin's record in preventing infection in the baby. Neurosyphilis, with its ability to mimic other brain diseases, remains a clinical challenge. Diagnosis depends on suspecting it and doing a spinal tap. High white blood cells, high protein, and, when present, a positive CSF VDRL. The CSF VDRL is very specific when positive, but disappointingly not very sensitive. CSF treponemal tests are more sensitive, but less specific. Treatment takes a lot of resources, long IV therapy, and careful follow-up with clinical and blood test monitoring. In the era of HIV, managing neurosyphilis has added layers of complexity. HIV changes the course of syphilis in ways that matter. Higher rates of blood test failure to respond, unusual symptoms, and, in some studies, a greater risk of brain involvement. So doctors have to watch more closely and lean toward investigation. Congenital syphilis sits at the painful meeting point of biology and social failure. The spread of Treponema pallidum from mother to baby can cause miscarriage, stillbirth, early birth, or the full range of classic signs in newborns
if treatment isn't given in time. Prevention is simple in theory. Screen pregnant women early and treat those who are positive with penicillin. In practice, the obstacle is access. When prenatal care is delayed or missing because of poverty, stigma, distrust of health services, or migration, pregnant women fall through the cracks. The result has been a worrying rise in congenital syphilis in many countries in the early 21st century, a return that public health workers had hoped belonged to another era. The clinical response must be paired with social action. Make early prenatal screening universal. Repeat screening in the third trimester in high-risk areas. Treat quickly and manage partners. Surveillance is the thread that connects clinical care to population health. And here too the old ghosts return. Disease reporting systems rely on doctors and labs reporting cases, on public health follow-up, and on honest communication with patients. But stigma, anonymous sex made easier by apps, migration that crosses borders, and the reality of reinfection all complicate the picture. Blood tests themselves don't tell when a person was infected. Treponemal tests stay positive for life, and non-treponemal levels must be read in context. Reinfection can cause levels to rise again, but telling the difference between treatment failure and a new exposure sometimes requires detective work that public health departments don't have the staff or money to do. Marginalized networks, people who use drugs, sex workers, undocumented migrants, and some communities of men who have sex with men often carry a heavier load and yet are harder to reach. Surveillance that ignores social geography is blind. Today's research priorities reflect both old problems and new technology. A vaccine is the holy grail and hard to reach. Treponema pallidum's ability to change its surface proteins, especially in the TPR family, makes vaccine design a major scientific puzzle. Molecular epidemiology, whole genome sequencing tied to social network data, offers the chance to find transmission clusters and new resistance in near real time. Diagnostic innovation aims for a single point-of-care test that can both find treponemal antibodies and give a non-treponemal titer, so that doctors in remote clinics can diagnose and stage the disease for the right treatment in one visit. Antibiotic stewardship and alternatives to penicillin are another area. Doxycycline remains effective in many cases for non-pregnant patients, and ceftriaxone shows promise for some uses. But no oral drug has taken the place of penicillin since macrolide resistance spread. Public health practice is also trying new approaches to prevention. Doxycycline, used as post-exposure prophylaxis in some trials, has reduced bacterial STIs in certain high-risk groups, especially among men who have sex with men on HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's a promising tool, not a magic bullet. The trade-off is the pressure this puts on the broader world of antibiotics. Doxycycline use can lead to resistance in other bacteria, and the overall effects are still being studied. The math is complex and needs careful watching, balancing individual benefit against community risk. If the biology and clinical story are the body of medicine, the final lesson of the pox is written in the margins as social and ethical practice. The history of syphilis is an argument that medical advances alone don't end epidemics. They just change the terms of the struggle. The pox has taught three connected lessons that matter today. First, medicine without justice can be medicine without results. Early 20th century campaigns that relied on jail, forced exams, and policing may have cut some transmission on paper, but they pushed away the very people whose cooperation was needed for lasting public health success. Today, programs that respect freedom and dignity, community-led testing, outreach by peers, services that meet people where they are, get far better results than those built on force. Where sex work is a crime, workers are pushed into the shadows, making outreach and prevention harder. Where harm reduction is allowed and supported, health improves. The Sonagachi project in Kolkata, started in the 1990s, is a modern counterexample. Sex workers organized, demanded rights, used collective bargaining, and got better health outcomes and more power in dealing with clients and officials. Choice beats control, and that's a moral truth with practical effects. Second, trust is part of clinical care. The ethical scandals of the past are not just history. Their effects shape today's trust in institutions. Tuskegee and Guatemala are not just footnotes. They are reasons why communities may say no to screening, why pregnant women may fear the clinic, why migrants may avoid public health programs. Rebuilding trust requires humility, reparations where fitting, open oversight, and lasting partnerships with affected communities. It also needs legal protections, keeping health data private, protecting people from deportation for seeking care, and limiting the use of public health reports for punishment. Third, tools must be paired with social policy. Penicillin and PCR are necessary, but not enough. Preventing congenital syphilis or stopping spread in marginalized city networks demands affordable prenatal care, housing help, substance use programs, mental health services, and laws that reduce fear. It needs policies that see the social roots of infection: poverty, gender inequality, migration, incarceration, and address them as actively as clinics treat sores. So what should a 21st century policymaker or doctor remember when they close the books and go home? Remember that a stamp can make a person disappear on paper, but not in life. Remember that the clinical rules you use come from a history that sometimes turns science into a weapon. Carry that knowledge like a light into the exam room. Don't let convenience take the place of ethics. And don't let the clear appeal of law blind you to the messier, slower work of building trust. There are practical steps that follow from those memories. Make prenatal screening truly universal and repeat it in high-risk cases. Make sure penicillin is in every clinic and that steps to safely give it to allergic pregnant women are in place. Invest in point-of-care tests that combine treponemal detection with a rough, non-treponemal level. Give public health departments the resources to do real partner services, not just fax names across counties, but support partners with testing, treatment, and privacy. Support prevention led by communities, centering the voices of sex workers, migrants, and other marginalized groups. Accept TE at decriminalizing sex work is a public health action, as well as a rights issue. Make vaccine research and molecular surveillance a priority so that resistance doesn't catch us off guard, as macrolide resistance did. Finally, build ethical oversight and community consent into every research and action plan so that the sins of the mid-20th century are not repeated. History can be a lullaby that soothes us into comfort, or a slow, steady voice that stays in our minds until we act differently. The story of syphilis is a long record of both cruelty and care, of stamps and scalpels, of legislatures and labs. If we close the record thinking only about bacterial curves and legal rules, we've learned only half the lesson. The rest comes when policymakers and doctors choose fairness over ease, listening over punishment, and partnership over control. If that can be the final line of our long account, then the pox will have taught us not just how to treat an infection, but how to govern with decency, and how to remember always that the health of a society is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable. So where does that leave us today? After centuries of fear, blame, brutal treatments, scientific breakthroughs, and painful ethical failures, syphilis is still with us. It hasn't been eradicated. It hasn't gone away. In fact, in many parts of the world, it's making a troubling comeback. You might think that in the 21st century, with all our advanced medicine, a disease like syphilis would be a footnote, something we dealt with long ago, like smallpox or polio. But the reality is more complicated, and the reasons why syphilis persists tell us as much about our societies as they do about the bacterium itself. Let's start with the numbers. According to the World Health Organization, every year there are over 7 million new cases of syphilis worldwide. That's not a relic of the past. That's happening right now. In high-income countries, rates have been rising steadily over the past 2 decades. The United States, for example, saw a nearly 80% increase in syphilis cases between 2018 and 2022 alone. Congenital syphilis, babies born with the infection, has more than tripled in recent years. These aren't just statistics. They represent real families, real suffering, and a failure of public health systems to keep up. So why is syphilis still here? Part of it is the same reason it spread so quickly in the 15th century: human behavior and social conditions. Syphilis is a disease of intimacy, and intimacy is shaped by everything, from economics to education to access to healthcare. When people lack stable housing, when they can't afford regular checkups, when they face stigma for seeking help, the disease finds a way to survive.
It's no accident that syphilis rates are highest among marginalized groups.
Men who have sex with men, people who use drugs, sex workers, and communities of color who have been historically underserved by the medical system. And there's the matter of testing and treatment. Even though we have a cure, penicillin, which is still the gold standard after all these years, getting that cure to the people who need it isn't always straightforward.
In many places, a single shot of penicillin costs more than a day's wages. Clinics may be hours away.
And for pregnant women, missing that one shot can mean their baby is born with a preventable disease. Congenital syphilis is a marker of systemic failure. It tells us that somewhere along the line, a pregnant person fell through the cracks because of poverty, because of racism, because of lack of insurance, because of a healthcare system that wasn't designed with them in mind. But it's not just about access. It's also about awareness. Syphilis has a reputation as a historical disease, something frere. Old mold textbooks and black and white photos. Many people today don't think about it as a real, present danger. They might not know the symptoms, which can be mild or easily mistaken for something else. That lack of awareness leads to delayed diagnosis, which leads to more transmission, and in some cases, to the late-stage complications we talked about earlier. Neurological damage, heart problems, blindness. The great imitator is still imitating. And then there's the issue of antibiotic resistance. We're lucky that Treponema pallidum hasn't yet developed widespread resistance to penicillin, but we've already seen it shrug off other antibiotics, like azithromycin, which was once a promising alternative. The more we use antibiotics, the more we risk pushing the bacterium to adapt. That means our last line of defense, penicillin, must be used wisely. But in a world where drug shortages, supply chain disruptions, and cost barriers exist, even that tried and true cure isn't always available when and where it's needed. So what does the future hold? Researchers are working on a vaccine, but it's a tough nut to crack. Treponema pallidum is a master of disguise. It can change its surface proteins to evade the immune system. Developing a vaccine that offers lasting protection is a scientific challenge that may take years, if not decades. In the meantime, we have to rely on the tools we have: testing, treatment, and prevention. But prevention isn't just about handing out condoms or telling people to be careful. It's about addressing the root causes that make people vulnerable. It's about decriminalizing sex work so that workers can access health care without fear. It's about providing stable housing and mental health services to people who use drugs. It's about making prenatal care truly universal and free of judgment. It's about rebuilding trust between communities and the medical institutions that have, at times, betrayed them. Tuskegee is not ancient history. The men who were lied to, the families who suffered, they are within living memory. Their descendants still carry the weight of that betrayal. When we talk about why some communities are hesitant to get tested or vaccinated or to seek care, we have to acknowledge that history. We have to do the slow, patient work of earning back trust, not through press releases, but through consistent, respectful, community-led care. There's also a role for new technologies. Point-of-care tests that can give results in minutes are being developed. Self-testing kits could allow people to check their status in private, reducing the barrier of stigma. Telemedicine could connect patients in rural areas to specialists who can manage neurosyphilis or congenital cases. And better surveillance systems using molecular epidemiology can help public health officials track outbreaks in real time and target resources where they are most needed. But technology alone won't solve the problem. The lesson of the pox, across 5 centuries, is that disease is never just biological. It's social, economic, political, and deeply personal. Every time we've tried to control syphilis purely through force, through quarantine, through criminalization, through surveillance, we have made things worse in the long run. Every time we've approached it with humility, with a focus on dignity and access, we've seen progress. Think about the difference between the early 20th century and today. 100 years ago, people with syphilis were often locked away, treated with toxic mercury, and shamed as moral failures. Today we have a cure that's safe, effective, and relatively simple. But having the cure isn't enough if people can't get it. Having a test isn't enough if people are too afraid to take it. Knowing the science isn't enough if we don't. She also addressed the human side. This is where storytelling comes in. The reason we've spent so much time on this journey, through royal courts and colonial ports, through battlefields and laboratories, through the shame of Tuskegee and the hope of penicillin, is because stories shape how we see disease. When syphilis was just a foreign disease or a moral disease, we responded with blame and exclusion. When it became a bacterial infection that could be treated, we started to think differently. But even today, the stigma lingers. People still whisper about it. People still avoid getting tested because they're afraid of what their friends or family might think. And that silence allows the infection to spread. So if there's one thing to take away from this long history, it's this. The fight against syphilis is not just a medical fight. It's a fight for justice, for trust, for empathy. It's about building healthcare systems that reach everyone, not just those with money or status. It's about remembering the mistakes of the past, the racism, the coercion, the indifference, and committing to do better. We have the tools to eliminate syphilis as a public health threat. We know how to test, how to treat, how to prevent congenital transmission. What we lack is the political will and the social infrastructure to make those tools available to all. Every case of congenital syphilis today is a failure of that will. Every preventable case of neurosyphilis is a gap in our collective commitment. But there's also reason for hope. Around the world, community organizations are doing incredible work. Sex worker-led groups in places like India, Kenya, and Brazil have driven down infection rates by building trust and providing care on their own terms. Harm reduction programs that offer not just clean needles, but also STI testing and treatment have reached people who would never set foot in a traditional clinic. And a new generation of public health leaders is pushing for policies that treat sex work as work, that fund community health workers, and that center the voices of those most affected. The story of syphilis is not over. It's still being written in clinics and bedrooms, in policy meetings and community centers, and the ending depends on choices we make now. Will we choose stigma or solidarity? Will we choose shortcuts or lasting solutions? Will we remember the lessons of the past or repeat them? The pox that slipped beneath silks and into crowns that reshaped medicine and morality, that exposed the cruelty of empires and the courage of reformers. That pox is still here, asking us the same questions it has always asked. How do we care for the most vulnerable among us? How do we balance individual freedom with public health? How do we face a disease without turning on each other? There are no easy answers. But if this long history teaches us anything, it's that the best responses to disease are not walls and stamps, but doors and trust. Not blame, but treatment. Not forgetting, but remembering. With honesty, with humility, and with a commitment to do better than those who came before. So as we close this chapter, let's carry that forward. Let's be the generation that finally makes syphilis a thing of the past, not by pretending it's gone, but by facing it head-on, with all the tools we have, and with the compassion that every human being deserves. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If you're watching from somewhere in the world, drop your location in the comments. I'd love to know where this story reached. And remember, history isn't just something that happens to us. It's something we make, every day, in the choices we choose. Let's make it a story we can be proud of. So where does that leave us today? After centuries of fear, blame, brutal treatments, scientific breakthroughs, and painful ethical failures, syphilis is still with us. It hasn't been eradicated. It hasn't gone away. In fact, in many parts of the world, it's making a troubling comeback. You might think that in the 21st century, with all our advanced medicine, a disease like syphilis would be a footnote, something we deal with long ago, like smallpox or polio. But the reality is more complicated, and the reasons why syphilis persists tell us as much about our societies as they do about the bacterium itself. Let's start with the numbers. According to the World Health Organization, every year, there are over 7 million new cases of syphilis worldwide. That's not a relic of the past. That's happening right now. In high-income countries, rates have been rising steadily over the past 2 decades. The United States, for example, saw a nearly 80% increase in syphilis cases between 2018 and 2022 alone. Congenital syphilis, babies born with the infection, has more than tripled in recent years. In 2022, there were over 3,700 cases of congenital syphilis in the U.S., leading to more than 200 stillbirths and infant deaths. These aren't just statistics. They represent real families, real suffering, and a failure of public health systems to keep up. Across Europe, the story is similar. Countries like the UK, Ireland, and Germany have reported sharp increases in syphilis diagnoses, particularly among gay and bisexual men. In parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, rates have climbed to levels not seen since the early 2000s. In low and middle-income countries, the burden is often hidden, underreported, undiagnosed, untreated. The WHO estimates that more than 500,000 pregnant women worldwide have active syphilis each year, leading to hundreds of thousands of adverse birth outcomes. Almost all of these are preventable. The fact that they're still happening is a global scandal. So why is syphilis still here? Part of it is the same reason it spread so quickly in the 15th century: human behavior and social conditions. Syphilis is a disease of intimacy, and intimacy is shaped by everything from economics to education to access to healthcare. When people lack stable housing, when they can't afford regular checkups, when they face stigma for seeking help, the disease finds a way to survive. It's no accident that syphilis rates are highest among marginalized groups: men who have sex with men, people who use drugs, sex workers, and communities of color who have been historically underserved by the medical system. Take the United States again. Black Americans, who make up about 13% of the population, account for nearly 30% of syphilis cases. Indigenous communities have rates several times higher than white populations. These disparities aren't biological, they are structural. They're the result of decades of unequal healthcare access, housing segregation, mass incarceration, and the lingering effects of medical racism like Tuskegee. When people don't trust the system, or when the system isn't designed to reach them, the disease spreads. Then there's the matter of testing and treatment. Even though we have a cure, penicillin, which is still the gold standard after all these years, getting that cure to the people who need it isn't always straightforward. In many places, a single shot of penicillin costs more than a day's wages. Clinics may be hours away. And for pregnant women, missing that one shot can mean their baby is born with a preventable disease. Congenital syphilis is a marker of systemic failure. It tells us that somewhere along the line, a pregnant person fell through the cracks because of poverty, because of racism, because of lack of insurance, because of a lack of insurance, because of a healthcare system that wasn't designed with them in mind. But it's not just about access, it's also about awareness. Syphilis has a reputation as a historical disease, something from old textbooks and black and white photos. Many people today don't think about it as a real present danger. They might not know the symptoms, which can be mild or easily mistaken for something else. That lack of awareness leads to delayed diagnosis, which leads to more transmission, and in some cases, to the late-stage complications we talked about earlier: neurological damage, heart problems, blindness. The great imitator is still imitating. And then there's the issue of antibiotic resistance. We're lucky that Treponema pallidum hasn't yet developed widespread resistance to penicillin, but we've already seen it shrug off other antibiotics, like azithromycin, which was once a promising alternative. The more we use antibiotics, the more we risk pushing the bacterium to adapt. That means our last line of defense. Penicillin must be used wisely. But in a world where drug shortages, supply chain disruptions, and cost barriers exist, even that tried and true cure isn't always available when and where it's needed. So what does the future hold? Researchers are working on a vaccine, but it's a tough nut to crack. Treponema pallidum is a master of disguise. It can change its surface proteins to evade the immune system. Developing a vaccine that offers lasting protection is a scientific challenge that may take years, if not decades, In the meantime, we have to rely on the tools we have: testing, treatment, and prevention.
But prevention isn't just about handing out condoms or telling people to be careful. It's about addressing the root causes that make people vulnerable.
It's about decriminalizing sex work so that workers can access health care without fear. It's about providing stable housing and mental health services to people who use drugs. It's about making prenatal care truly universal and free of judgment. It's about rebuilding trust between communities and the medical institutions that have, at times, betrayed them. Tuskegee is not ancient history. The men who were lied to, the families who suffered, they are within living memory. The descendants still carry the weight of that betrayal. When we talk about why some communities are hesitant to get tested or vaccinated or to seek care, we have to acknowledge that history. We have to do the slow, patient work of earning back trust, not through press releases, but through consistent, respectful, community-led care. There's also a role for new technologies. Point-of-care tests that can give results in minutes are being developed. Self-testing kits could allow people to check their status in private, reducing the barrier of stigma. Telemedicine could connect patients in rural areas to specialists who can manage neurosyphilis or congenital cases. And better surveillance systems, using molecular epidemiology, can help public health officials track outbreaks in real time and target resources where they're most needed. But technology alone won't solve the problem. The lesson of the pox across 5 centuries is that disease is never just biological. It's social, economic, political, and deeply personal. Every time we've tried to control syphilis purely through force, through quarantine, through criminalization, through surveillance, we had made things worse in the long run. Every time we've approached it with humility, with a focus on dignity and access, we've seen progress. Think about the difference between the early 20th century and today. 100 years ago, people with syphilis were often locked away, treated with toxic mercury, and shamed as moral failures. Today, we have a cure that's safe, effective, and relatively simple. But having the cure isn't enough if people can't get it. Having a test isn't enough if people are too afraid to take it. Knowing the science isn't enough if we don't also address the human side. Now let's look at some of the places where this approach has worked, because there's real hope, and it's found in the most unlikely corners. In the red light districts of Kolkata, India, a project called Sonagachi started in the early 1990s with a simple but radical idea: let sex workers lead. Instead of outside experts coming in to tell them how to behave, the project trained sex workers as peer educators. They organized themselves into collectives, ran their own clinics, negotiated with police, and demanded rights. The result? HIV and syphilis rates dropped dramatically. Condom use soared, and the women gained something even more important: a voice. Sonagachi became a model that spread across India and beyond. The lesson is clear. When you treat people as partners rather than problems, health improves. In Kenya, the sex worker-led organization SWAP, Sex Workers Outreach Program, has been doing similar work for years. They run clinics staffed by peers, offer mobile testing, and advocate for decriminalization. Their approach recognizes that you can't separate health from human rights. When sex workers are constantly harassed or arrested, they're not going to walk into a government clinic. But when services are brought to them by people they trust, they engage. In Brazil, the public health system has long embraced a harm reduction philosophy. Community health workers, many from the favelas themselves, go door to door, building relationships, offering testing, and connecting people to care. Syphilis rates have been stubborn, but the infrastructure of trust that Brazil has built over decades has proven crucial during other health crises, like Zika and COVID-19. It's a reminder that investing in community health isn't just about one disease, it's about creating a system that can respond to whatever comes next. In the United States, some cities are beginning to adopt similar strategies. San Francisco, which has seen high rates of syphilis among gay and bisexual men, has invested heavily in community-based organizations. They've funded peer navigation programs, where people with lived experience help others get tested and treated. They've expanded access to doxycycline post-exposure prophylaxis, or DoxyPEP, for high-risk groups, which studies have shown can reduce B. Bacterial STIs significantly. They've also worked to destigmatize sex through public messaging that focuses on health rather than judgment. But these successes are often underfunded and fragile. For every city that's doing it right, there are dozens where public health budgets have been slashed, where clinics have closed, where the only message is fear and silence. The resurgence of syphilis in many places is not inevitable. It's the result of choices. Choices to cut funding for STI programs. Choices to prioritize punishment over care. Choices to ignore the social determinants that make people vulnerable. This brings us back to the question of moralizing. Throughout history, syphilis has been used to shame, to blame, to divide. Even today, you'll hear people talk about clean and unclean test results as if having an infection makes someone dirty. You'll see headlines that sensationalize outbreaks, implying that certain groups are irresponsible. That language has real consequences. It makes people afraid to test. It makes them hide their status from partners. It lets policymakers off the hook. Because if it's about personal morality, why invest in public health? Because if it's about personal morality, why invest in public health? But we know better. We know that syphilis doesn't care about morality. It doesn't care about borders or beliefs. It's a bacterium, and like all bacteria, it spreads where conditions are right. The conditions that help it spread today are poverty, inequality, lack of healthcare, stigma, and criminalization. Change those conditions, and you change the course of the disease. That's a big ask. It means rethinking how we fund healthcare. It means decriminalizing sex work and drug use. It means ending the racist policies that leave communities behind. It means rebuilding trust with people who have every reason to distrust the medical system. These aren't easy fixes, and they won't happen overnight, but they are possible. We've seen it happen in places as different as Kolkata and San Francisco, as Kenya and Brazil. And here's the thing. The same tools we need to fight syphilis are the tools we need to build a healthier world overall. Universal prenatal care doesn't just prevent congenital syphilis. It saves mothers and babies from all kinds of complications. Community health workers don't just do STI testing. They connect people to primary care, mental health services, and social support. Decriminalizing sex work doesn't just make STI prevention easier. It protects people from violence and exploitation. So when we invest in the fight against syphilis, we're investing in a broader vision of health justice. This is where storytelling comes in. The reason we've spent so much time on this journey, through royal courts and colonial ports, through battlefields and laboratories, through the shame of Tuskegee and the hope of penicillin, is because stories shape how we see disease. When syphilis was just a foreign disease or a moral disease, we responded with blame and exclusion. When it became a bacterial infection that could be treated, we started to think differently. But even today, the stigma lingers. People still whisper about it. People still avoid getting tested because they're afraid of what their friends or family might think. And that silence allows the infection to spread. So if there's one thing to take away from this long history, it's this. The fight against syphilis is not just a medical fight. It's a fight for justice, for trust, for empathy. It's about building healthcare systems that reach everyone, not just those with money or status. It's about remembering the mistakes of the past, the racism, the coercion, the indifference, and committing to do better. We have the tools to eliminate syphilis as a public health threat. We know how to test, how to treat, how to prevent congenital transmission. What we lack is the political will and the social infrastructure to make those tools available to all. Every case of congenital syphilis today is a failure of that will. Every preventable case of neurosyphilis is a gap in our collective commitment. But there's also reason for hope. Around the world, community organizations are doing incredible work. Sex worker-led groups in places like India, Kenya, and Brazil have driven down infection rates by building trust and providing care on their own terms. Harm reduction programs that offer not just clean needles, but also STI testing and treatment have reached people who would never set foot in a traditional clinic. And a new generation of public health leaders is pushing for policies that treat sex work as work, that fund community health workers, and that center the voices of those most affected. The story of syphilis is not over. It's still being written in clinics and bedrooms, in policy meetings and community centers, and the ending depends on choices we make now. Will we choose stigma or solidarity? Will we choose shortcuts or lasting solutions? Will we remember the lessons of the past or repeat them? The pox that slipped beneath silks and into crowns, that reshaped medicine and morality, that exposed the cruelty of empires and the courage of reformers. That pox is still here, asking us the same questions it has always asked. How do we care for the most vulnerable among us? How do we balance individual freedom with public health? How do we face a disease without turning on each other? There are no easy answers. But if this long history teaches us anything, it's that the best responses to disease are not walls and stamps, but doors and trust. Not blame, but treatment. Not forgetting, but remembering. With honesty, with humility, and with a commitment to do better than those who came before. So as we close this chapter, let's carry that forward. Let's be the generation that finally makes syphilis a thing of the past, not by pretending it's gone, but by facing it head-on, with all the tools we have, and with the compassion that every human being deserves. I want to leave you with one final image. Imagine a world where every pregnant person can walk into a clinic without fear and get tested, where every positive result is met with immediate, non-judgmental treatment, where sex workers are seen as experts in their own health, not as vectors of disease, where men who have sex with men can talk openly with their doctors about prevention, where the legacy of Tuskegee is not a permanent scar, but a permanent lesson, a reminder of what we must never do again. That world is possible. It's not some distant utopia. It's a choice we can make, starting now. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If you're watching from somewhere in the world, drop your location in the comments. I'd love to know where this story reached. And remember, history isn't just something that happens to us. It's something we make. Every day, in the choices we choose. Let's make it a story we can be proud of. And so, this journey through centuries of science, scandal, and human struggle comes to a close. What started as a tiny, unnoticed sore in the 15th century became a mirror reflecting our deepest fears, our greatest medical breakthroughs, and our most painful ethical failures. The story of syphilis is not just a history of a disease, it's a history of us. It shows how we react to the unknown, how we treat those who suffer, and how we can choose, over time, to do better. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this video resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.